we're going to be focusing on what I think is one of the worst aspects of the brutality of war. We all know what we're talking about here. We're talking about the brutality of war, but particularly in relation to sexual violence. It can't be seen as an inevitable byproduct of a brutal war. It's not acceptable. Whoever it's committed by, wherever, whenever, just not acceptable. Rape is a crime. It's a war crime. And those who are committing it cannot go unpunished. And I'll say that very clearly this morning. I'm delighted to hear from Pramila Patten. I've already spoken with her since she came back from the region. She has important things to say to us, not least also I think she'll touch this morning on the fact that trafficking is also an inevitable part. There are 15 million people who have been displaced from Ukraine since the war began. Risky business, trafficking of vulnerable people, where the vulnerable people are exposed to sexual violence. That's women, men, boys, children, young women. So we want to see that. An Irish woman, Siobhan Mullally, is actually the UN Special Rapporteur on trafficking. Spoken with her recently also. She's working with people in the region. It's a very big concern. Of course, there's one way to solve all this, which is that Russia stops its senseless war, and I'll repeat that again this morning also.
Ambassador, on Syria, when do you hope to circulate a draft resolution?
Well, look, we're beginning our process. You watched us last year. Norway and Ireland take this as a very serious responsibility. We want to talk to everyone on the Council and to actors from the region who have an interest and an influence in the issue. So we're continuing our conversations and we'll keep you updated. Thanks.
Did you? Still a little, like you said, a little removed from all the BS.
But with the family and the transportation.
Okay, makes sense. Sure, sure. Sometimes I walk when I took the train, I used to walk over the bridge just for that one stop. You know, it's very. Oh, nice, nice. Have a good day. Okay.
Zakarpattia, and Zhytomyr regions. Women constitute most of the alleged victims. 56 of 124 allegations concern women. 49 of the allegations are against children, 41 against girls, 7 against boys, and in one case, the gender was unknown. 19 of the allegations are against men, including rape, attempted rape, forced public stripping, and threat of sexual violence. Verification of cases is still ongoing. From our experience of conflict the world over, we know that sexual violence is the most consistently and massively underreported violation, and that available data only represents the tip of the iceberg. An active battlefield is never conducive to accurate bookkeeping. But if we wait for hard data and statistics, it will always be too late. This is why we must realize immediately on the basis of our common conviction that even one case of sexual violence is unacceptable. We do not need hard data for a scaled-up humanitarian response, nor for all parties to put in place preventive measures. In this regard, I wish to acknowledge and commend the leadership by example of the Ukrainian authorities in their agreement of a framework of cooperation with the United Nations on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence that was signed by the Deputy Prime Minister Olha Stefanishina on 3rd of May in Kyiv as an outcome of my visit. This framework will serve as the basis for a comprehensive and multifaceted preventive and service response and more effective coordination of all stakeholders, including the United Nations agencies in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Allow me, Mr. President, to emphasize 5 critical areas of the framework. First, strengthening rule of law and accountability as a central aspect of deterrence and prevention of crimes of sexual violence. Second, strengthening the capacity of the security and defense sector to prevent sexual violence. This will require specific action plans by the military, police, border guards, and other government security and defense forces, encompassing also over 100,000 volunteer forces. Third, ensuring that survivors of sexual violence, as well as their children, have access to comprehensive services, including sexual and reproductive health, psychological, legal, socioeconomic services, and reintegration support. This will entail support to Ukraine's national health and social services systems. Fourth, even as we deal with the immediate challenge of conflict unabated, we must cast ahead to ongoing and future negotiations for cessation of hostilities and ensure that sexual violence is addressed in the framework of a ceasefire agreement, and that such crimes are ultimately reflected in specific provisions of any peace agreement, including those related to security arrangements and transitional justice mechanisms. These include ensuring that amnesties for sexual violence crimes are explicitly prohibited. Furthermore, it is essential that we ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all political processes, including negotiations for peace. Ukrainian women-led organizations are active on the front lines of the sexual and gender-based violence response, yet women have been conspicuously absent from the negotiating table thus far. Fifth, addressing conflict-related trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation and prostitution. This will entail awareness raising and training of military personnel, border guards, police and immigration officials, and will require action of neighboring and receiving countries and the institutions of the European Union. Too often, the needs of women and girls in conflict settings have been sidelined and treated as an afterthought. This framework of cooperation makes them an explicit priority, and I call on the solidarity of this Council and the international donor community to support the Ukrainian authorities and relevant UN entities to implement the framework. Fundamentally, this is as important for Ukraine's future as the defense and security sector expenditures, for which billions of dollars have already been mobilized. I also wish to note that last week I had the opportunity to debrief the mission of the Russian Federation to the UN on my visit to Ukraine. I emphasized that my office is at the disposal of all parties to the conflict to support the implementation of preventive measures that mitigate the acute risk of conflict-related sexual violence. Resolutions 1820, 1888, 1960, 2106, and 2467 provide a clear and unanimously agreed preventive framework, which includes issuance of clear orders through military chains of command that reinforce zero tolerance for sexual violence, and the designation of high-level civilian and military focal points to engage with my office and other relevant UN actors, among other measures. I look forward to further consultation with the mission of the Russian Federation to the UN on possible modalities for cooperation in this sphere, including the facilitation of access to areas not under Ukrainian government control. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to bring particular attention to the trafficking dimension. As the Secretary General stated in March, for predators and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy. It is an opportunity. Women and children fleeing the conflict are being targeted for trafficking and exploitation, in some cases facing further exposure to rape and other risks while seeking refuge. In addition to my engagement with the Polish and Moldovan local and state authorities, I visited reception centers and border crossing points in both countries. We must acknowledge and commend the outpouring of financial and moral support for the Ukrainian people by national and local authorities, as well as private citizens, which is perhaps unprecedented in modern times. Yet the protection challenges related to the displacement in the past 100 days of close to 14 million people, mostly women and children, 6.8 million of whom have fled across borders, is also unprecedented. From the outset of this conflict, heightened risk of trafficking in persons, including for the purpose of sexual exploitation and prostitution, have been alarmingly evident. The lack of consistent vetting of accommodation offers and transportation arrangements is a serious concern, as well as the limited capacity of protection services to address the velocity and volume of displacement. There are also concerns regarding the multiplicity of volunteers with limited vetting and little or no training or experience. In Chemical, my team and I visited the site of the Tesco supermarket that has been converted into a receiving center for Ukrainian refugees. While the range of services being provided is exemplary, there are grave security and protection concerns in a facility run by volunteers and with only a bare-bone presence of UN agencies. For example, we heard a number of credible anecdotal accounts from humanitarian staff. With minimal security screening, a man registers as a volunteer at the Tesco Center in the afternoon and enters the French room where refugees are waiting for transport to France. At that time, he makes contact with a 19-year-old woman whom he later wakes up at 2 a.m. offering a ride to France. Another volunteer becomes suspicious of this individual roaming the sleeping quarters in the early morning hours and intervenes. Another man wearing a yellow volunteer's vest and standing with a sign at the Chemichov train station hall is offering free transport from Poland to Germany. Other volunteers became suspicious and informed local law enforcement when they noticed that the man was selecting only young women for transportation in his minivan. In Warsaw, during a meeting with officials from the Ministry of Justice, a judge of a criminal court shared with me how while she was in the Chechov reception center, she was personally approached by a man who sought her help to have access to 8 young women and adolescent girls whom he had identified and wanted to offer transportation to Germany. She told me that even as a judge, she was not initially suspicious until a volunteer intervened and informed her that the same men had been coming every 2 days to handpick young women and girls. The judge made an urgent appeal for awareness raising and training of law enforcement officials and other relevant actors. Within the humanitarian response architecture in Ukraine, a temporary task force on human trafficking has been established to strengthen coordination and foster cross-border cooperation, including among criminal justice actors. However, it is critical to ensure that effective protection systems are in place in all transit and destination countries and at all border crossings. Strengthening the overall response to trafficking is a critical aspect of the framework of cooperation, which will also require a coherent and coordinated response at the level of the European institutions. This is of utmost urgency, as I believe that this humanitarian crisis is turning into a human trafficking crisis. This requires a concerted, integrated and holistic cross-border response by humanitarian partners, law enforcement agencies, border forces, immigration officials, and political leaders. A regional compact is urgently required. And in this regard, I'm encouraged that His Excellency Mr. Charles Michel, President of the European Council, is in the Security Council chamber today, as I believe that this issue will require European leadership at the highest levels to address this problem. It will also require the continued focus and leadership of the UN Security Council in line with Resolution 23 conflict-related human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence. I consider this dimension as a core aspect of the CRSV mandate and the Ukraine crisis as a critical litmus test for the implementation of Resolution 2331. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, during my mission, I witnessed with awe the resilience and fortitude shown by the communities affected by this conflict, including the women forced to flee their homes with their children, with nothing but the clothes on their back and the bag of belongings they were able to carry by hand. Many survivors have braved the risk of reprisals and backlash to tell their stories. We owe them more than solidarity. We owe them a swift and serious response. The prevalence of sexual violence in conflict throughout history teaches us that reinforcing prevention, protection, and service delivery is critical from the onset of any armed conflict. The framework of cooperation, which I have referred, paves the way politically for tangible support and technical advice and assistance from my office and the wider UN system, and will also serve as a platform for the mobilization of resources. To address this challenge, it is crucial to ensure that the level of political focus, as well as the allocation of resources for a comprehensive response, is commensurate with the scale and complexity of the problem. Finally, I wish to acknowledge that even as we focus on Ukraine, the ripple effects of this conflict are also being felt by women and girls in other war zones around the world who risk becoming forgotten victims of forgotten conflict. From Yemen to the Central African Republic, Afghanistan to Myanmar or Tigray in northern Ethiopia, resources are being drained and attention diverted. As other crises escalate behind the scenes, we must reassure all populations at risk that they are not forgotten and that international law is not an empty promise. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Patton for her briefing and for her availability while traveling, and I hope that the little technical glitches did not affect the entirety of the message. I now give the floor to Ms. Natalia Karbowska. Ms. Karbowska, you have the floor.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in such an important event today. My voice is the voice of my organization, which has been working on supporting women in Ukraine for 22 years. My voice is also the voice of hundreds of other women's rights organizations, which are working in Ukraine 24/7, supporting women, providing food and medicine, healing the trauma, and giving the strength to continue living to those women whose lives were destroyed by Russia, those who have been raped, those whose kids were killed, whose houses were burned. Every Ukrainian has a story of how this war started for her or him, the story that each of us will remember forever. For me, the war started at the meeting on localization of National Action Plan on 1325, UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Ukraine has adopted the second National Action Plan on implementation of the resolution, and on February 23-24 this year, we met in Kyiv with representatives of 13 regional coalitions on localization of 1325 of the national plan. The meeting was about the planning of our work for the year. Russian invasion forced us to finish that meeting earlier, but it didn't change our plans. The war showed that women, peace and security agenda in Ukraine is actual today more than ever. It has a new meaning, very concrete and clear one. The security of each and every woman is a security of the whole country. No one can feel safe when sexual violence and rape are taking place close to where you live. Women's organizations are usually the first ones that women who experience sexual violence approach. They provide psychological assistance. Together with law enforcement agencies, they document the cases and support investigation processes. I'm not going to tell you the stories of those women and children. you heard them. Yet, sexual violence in this war is the most hidden crime. And for every girl or a woman who is willing to tell her story, there are many other people who will be silent for years because of understanding of rape as a shame crime, because of the feelings, these feelings of shame among survivors, because of the feelings of guilt among those who were not able to defend them, because of the fear of getting in the same situation among neighbors. All this weaken the social connections in communities, and this is a strategy to establish control over communities. Russia is using sexual violence and rape as a terror to control civilians at the temporary occupied territories. Although the full scale of conflict-related sexual violence is not yet known, human rights activists and law enforcement agencies estimate that hundreds of cases have been committed, not just against women and girls, but also men and boys and people of other gender identities and of all ages. So I have a question. Russia is using terror against civilians in Ukraine. There is a lot of evidence to prove this. Why it is still in the UN Security Council? How it is possible that it participates in the UN peacekeeping operations? I was at the border during these 3 months. I was at the border with Poland and saw the faces of women refugees. No relatives, language barriers, no savings in the banks, just she, her child, and a suitcase. I remember a young woman from Chernihiv region. She didn't even have a suitcase. Everything was destroyed in her house by the Russian missile. She said that her only family member now is her cat. According to international organizations, due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Europe is experiencing now the largest displacement since the World War II. The majority of refugees are women and children, the two groups most vulnerable to become victims to sexual and labor abuse. There was huge work done by civil society and governments to protect refugees in Europe and prevent trafficking at the border crossing. I saw myself many volunteers at the border helping with registration, offering rights, providing accommodation, distributing the contacts of hotlines. But as the war continues, Ukrainian women refugees in Europe who initially planned temporary shelter are finding themselves in need of more permanent housing and work. This opens up new risks for sexual and labor exploitation. We also know the stories of women and children who were forced to go to Russia by Russian troops through the so-called filtration camps. I met a 16 years old boy, Roman, in Western Ukraine. It was 2 months ago. He's from Mariupol. A neighbor helped him to escape and brought to Western Ukraine. Roman's mother is in Russia. Last time he saw her was when she was brutally taken to the filtration camp. Nobody knows what happened to her and if Roman will ever see her again. There are hundreds of stories like this. How is this called? Trafficking, slavery, terror, and crime. Russia is using war crimes as a weapon in this war. Military experts confirm that there was no other war since the World War II when aggressor behaves so brutally with civilians. This is a violation of all international humanitarian laws. The Russian war against Ukraine is showing that the usual practices and old international security systems do not work anymore. We are revising National Action Plan on 1325 in Ukraine because the reality has changed. But we do believe that Resolution 1325 still is a powerful instrument. We just need to create new tools that will make it work properly at different levels and, very importantly, for women on the ground. I urge you to develop such instruments, to keep pressure with sanctions, to continue providing military and humanitarian support. Do more every day. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Karbowska for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Sherry Rollins-Weston.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, and esteemed speakers. And thank you to the government of Albania for inviting me to address the Security Council on behalf of Sesame Workshop, the nonprofit educational organization behind Sesame Street that has been reaching children with early learning for 50 years in over 150 countries. Over the last decade, we have been working with humanitarian organizations, governments, and UN agencies to support children and caregivers who face the trauma of conflict and displacement. To date, we have reached millions of young children affected by crises in the Middle East, Bangladesh, East Africa, Latin America, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. Today, you have heard about some of the most devastating impacts of war and conflict, including increased gender-based and sexual violence. In Ukraine, the gender dynamics of the crisis are particularly pronounced, with women and children accounting for 90% of all those who have fled the country. Inside Ukraine, the situation is equally dire. Today, I want to bring your focus to the impact this war is having on children, many of whom are witness and subject to these atrocities, and all of whom are deeply affected. I am here to urge the international community to prioritize young children and caregivers in its response to this conflict in order to help mitigate a crisis of generational proportions. Young children are not only incredibly vulnerable to the immediate physical impacts of war, but they also have the most to lose because of the early years are such a critical time in their development. There is no time in a child's life more fragile and more important than their first 5 years, when their brain is developing faster than at any other time in their life. This is also a period when the brain is most sensitive to a child's environment, and repeated exposure to traumatic events can inhibit brain development, with long-term repercussions on their cognitive abilities, their health, and productivity that extend long after they survive immediate danger. I ask you to look at this conflict through the lens of a child, growing up in the throes of war, shaken by bombs, forced to leave their homes and all they've ever known, without the stability that children so desperately need. And for their caregivers, who are still tasked each and every day with providing for their children while they themselves have been traumatized by violence. All of these effects are compounded in Ukraine in particular, because so many women and children have had to leave behind their fathers, brothers, uncles, and male family members. Right now, children are experiencing the kind of exposure to violence and stress that has the potential to derail their futures if they don't receive the right support. The urgency simply cannot be overstated. But the truth is that the international community does have viable solutions to support children and their caregivers, many of which can be integrated into existing humanitarian response. Today, I want to leave you with 3 ideas to support young children and caregivers during crisis. First, directly provide mental health and psychosocial support for the immediate needs of children as a first-line and life-saving intervention, and nothing less. Advocates for mental health in crisis contexts have begun to have some success in building support into the Ukraine response, which must be continued and expanded. Second, invest in early childhood development, from nurturing care to playful learning, and fold it into your humanitarian and national response plans. Quality early childhood development is proven to help mitigate the effects of the trauma children experience. And these interventions do not need to add significant cost. In fact, building early childhood support directly into existing interventions can be an effective use of limited resources. We've seen this in Jordan, where we're partnering with the International Rescue Committee and the Ministry of Health to integrate early childhood support directly into visits with healthcare providers. And in Ukraine, we're aligning our work with national education objectives, following the lead of the Ministry of Education and Science, who, despite extraordinary challenges, continues to reach Ukrainian children with invaluable education. Finally, we must not forget the caregivers. We know that the most important intervention for young children experiencing trauma is more engagement with a caring crisis and help caregivers provide the nurturing care children so desperately need. Early childhood interventions like these bolster children, communities, and societies at large. And yet, less than 3% of humanitarian assistance funding goes to this critical need, a number that simply must rise to meet the challenge of Ukraine impact of these issues discussed here today on children, prioritizing their needs and giving them the chance to thrive. How can they possibly be expected to have the skills they need to rebuild their society? Our hopes for a prosperous and peaceful future depend on the action we are taking now to support young children, because our futures depend on them. I urge the Council to prioritize children and their caregivers in responding to this crisis. If not, there will be lasting consequences for our future security and stability for generations to come. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Rollins-Weston for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. Et je donne la parole au représentant de la France.
I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie la représentante spéciale pour son engagement depuis le début de l'agression russe. Je salue la signature par l'Ukraine d'un cadre de coopération avec les Nations Unies. Je remercie Mme Karbowska et Mme Rollins-Weston pour leur témoignage et je rends hommage à toute la société civile engagée pour les droits des Ukrainiennes. Je me réjouis aussi de la participation à cette réunion du président du Conseil européen qui témoigne du soutien inébranlable de l'Union européenne à l'Ukraine. Depuis le début de l'agression russe, l'Union européenne a mobilisé plus de 4,6 milliards d'euros pour venir en aide aux Ukrainiens. Cet engagement porte sur tous les plans, budgétaires, humanitaires, mais aussi sur la lutte contre l'impunité, via notamment la création d'équipes d'enquête conjointes coordonnées par Eurojust. Les sanctions adoptées par l'Union européenne n'ont qu'un objectif, ramener la Russie au respect de la Charte des Nations Unies. De tels efforts sont essentiels car depuis plus de 100 jours, l'armée russe mène une guerre d'agression dont les effets sur les populations civiles s'aggravent chaque jour. La France est consternée face aux nombreuses allégations de violences sexuelles. Si elles sont avérées, elles constitueraient des crimes. Nous devons tous être les garants des résolutions de ce Conseil sur les violences sexuelles. Nous avons la responsabilité de soutenir les victimes. Elles doivent pouvoir témoigner sans être stigmatisées. La France soutient l'action des Nations Unies sur place pour établir les faits. Les responsables de ces violences doivent être jugés et punis. C'est la raison pour laquelle la France a mis à disposition de l'Ukraine une expertise pour collecter des preuves et établir les responsabilités. Nous sommes préoccupés par les risques pesant sur les populations déplacées. La France soutient pleinement l'action des Nations Unies visant à prévenir les risques de traite et de trafic d'êtres humains. À ce titre, nous saluons les efforts du Fonds des Nations Unies pour la population. Les victimes de violences doivent être défendues. La France appelle au renforcement de ce soutien. Monsieur le Président, face à cette agression aux conséquences dramatiques pour les populations civiles, la France reste entièrement mobilisée. Elle ne ménage pas ses efforts pour œuvrer au retour à la paix. Elle continue d'appeler au retrait total des troupes russes, conformément à ce qu'a exigé la Cour internationale de justice et à un plein respect du droit international humanitaire. Elle renouvelle enfin son soutien à toutes les Ukrainiennes. Il ne pourra y avoir de paix durable sans la pleine participation des femmes. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de la France pour sa déclaration. And I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la representante especial Patten, a la señora Karbowska y a la señora Rollins-Westin por sus presentaciones. Doy también la bienvenida al presidente del Consejo Europeo, Charles Michel. Los testimonios que hemos escuchado esta mañana nos revelan una dimensión adicional a las trágicas consecuencias de la invasión de Ucrania sobre la población civil. Según datos de los que disponemos, el 90% de las personas que han abandonado el país lo constituyen mujeres, niñas y niños, y el 60% de los desplazados internos son también mujeres, lo cual hace evidente que este conflicto tiene un ineludible componente de género. La situación de vulnerabilidad de todas estas mujeres, niñas y niños aumenta el riesgo de trata, incluyendo fines de explotación sexual, como también hemos escuchado esta mañana. Hace poco, escuchamos también en este Consejo a la alta comisionada Bachelet referirse a casos de violaciones de mujeres en áreas que están bajo control ruso, aunque dio cuenta, asimismo, de reportes de violencia sexual cometidos por ambas partes. Lo verdaderamente lamentable es que los informes disponibles parecen indicar que los incidentes de violencia sexual perpetrados contra mujeres y niñas van en aumento. El estigma, las convenciones sociales, los estereotipos a los que se enfrentan las víctimas y los limitados mecanismos para reportar incidentes dificultan las denuncias y la investigación cabal de estos crímenes. Como nos compartió la representante especial del secretario general Patten, tras su reciente visita a la región, los informes sobre mujeres ucranianas que fueron violadas y posteriormente asesinadas son muy preocupantes. Es prioritario entonces que se lleven a cabo las investigaciones de presuntos crímenes de guerra, crímenes de lesa humanidad y otras violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario para que los perpetradores sean enjuiciados y los crímenes no queden impunes. México está atento a la investigación en curso de la Fiscalía y de la Corte Penal Internacional, así como de la Comisión Internacional Independiente promovida por el Consejo de los Derechos Humanos. Señor presidente, reconocemos la importancia de la coordinación del Grupo de Protección que lidera ACNUR y seguiremos con especial atención el importante trabajo del Subgrupo de Violencia Sexual y de Género que encabeza el Fondo de Población de Naciones Unidas. Las consecuencias en el mediano y largo plazo de la guerra para la salud de toda la población y en particular las mujeres víctimas y sobrevivientes de la violencia sexual son motivo de gran preocupación. Es urgente que se garantice su acceso indiscriminado a los servicios de salud sexual y reproductiva, pero también a los de salud mental, que son en estos momentos vitales. Damos la bienvenida a la firma del marco de cooperación entre Naciones Unidas y el gobierno de Ucrania sobre la prevención y la respuesta a la violencia sexual relacionada con conflictos. Confiamos en que este marco de acción se constituya como un pilar para la prevención y para la disuasión. El sistema de las Naciones Unidas debe continuar recabando evidencia, datos desagregados y análisis con enfoque de género sobre violencia sexual y de género y trabajar coordinadamente con la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación. Estaremos pendientes de los resultados de su próxima visita a Ucrania este mes. Las mujeres han asumido un papel fundamental desde el inicio de la invasión rusa. y debemos garantizar su participación plena e igualitaria en la toma de decisiones y en las negociaciones que llegarán para poner fin a la guerra en Ucrania. Nuevamente, el llamado de México es a un alto al fuego inmediato que permita poner fin a esta tragedia. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since I was not here at the beginning of your presidency, let me enthusiastically welcome you to the assumption of the presidency role and wish you the best during this month. I also wish to thank you, Albania, for calling this very important meeting. And I also would like to give a special thanks to our briefers, SRSG Patton, Ms. Kabowska, and Ms. Rollins-Weston for your illuminating remarks. I welcome the participation of the Ukrainian PR in our midst today, as well as Mr. Michel, the President of the European Council. Since Russia launched its illegal and unprovoked further invasion of Ukraine, a mountain of credible reports of atrocities committed by Russia's forces against civilians has grown every day. These reports include horrific accounts of sexual violence. More and more allegations show Russia's soldiers sexually assaulting women and girls, as well as men and boys. We've heard from Ukraine's foreign minister of multiple cases of sexual violence by Russian soldiers in Ukrainian cities that were under the control of Russian forces. We've heard from Ukraine's deputy prime minister that Russian soldiers raped Ukrainian women for hours and then killed them. The corroborating evidence goes beyond Ukrainian officials. In Bucha, we have evidence of atrocities, including imagery that confirms the presence of mass graves. And you've heard just today from the SRSG. There in Bucha, the indications of Russia's brutality include credible reports of violence perpetrated up close and in cold blood. Individuals killed execution style, bodies showing signs of torture and sexual violence against women and girls. There have been multiple reports from survivors of Russia's soldiers breaking down doors to basements where women were sheltering and raping them. These terrible acts were done in front of their children, and they were filmed by the Russian soldiers. These are bone-chilling accounts, and we know for every account we hear, many more are unknown. In addition to the women suffering inside of Ukraine, we cannot forget that more than 90%, and we've heard this referred to several times today, 90% of refugees from Ukraine are women and children. And we've heard before in this council, women and children bear disproportionately high risks in this war. Family separation leaves girls in particular at increased risk for sexual exploitation and trafficking. And we've heard sobering reports of traffickers targeting women as they seek protection abroad. So, council members, we cannot stay silent. We must seek and achieve justice for victims, and we must do everything we can to prevent further violence. Responsibility starts first and foremost with Russia. As a reminder to the Russian Federation, Security Council Resolution 1820 recognized that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. Furthermore, under international humanitarian law, sexual violence is prohibited. It is on Russia to take measures within its forces and its proxy forces to ensure adherence to this resolution and to international humanitarian law. It is on Russia to stop rape, violence, and atrocities from within its ranks. It is on Russia to end this unconscionable, unprovoked war on the people of Ukraine, and we call on the Russian Federation to do just that. And though the primary responsibility rests with Russia, I also want to talk about what the rest of us can do to address this heartbreaking situation. The framework of cooperation established by Special Representative Patton and her team and signed with the government of Ukraine last month deserves our strong support. It should serve as a vehicle for UN alignment and coordination. We should share the key elements of this framework, and we should do everything we can to support the Ukrainian authorities as they follow the framework. The United States will continue to support Special Representative Patton's office to facilitate this important work. The Commission of Inquiry created by the Human Rights Council can also ensure Russia does not get away with hiding atrocities. Last month, the HRC passed another resolution that called for the Commission of Inquiry to address the events in the areas of the Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions with a view to holding those responsible to account. Both the Commission of Inquiry and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine are critical to ensuring accountability. Sharing information and documenting crimes is critical to ensuring accountability for crimes of rape and other forms of gender-based violence. This can only be done through effective investigations of reports of such crimes and trials in appropriate criminal courts. And all of this requires resources. Many on this council have emphasized their political commitments to preventing gender-based violence. Now is the time to provide proof of that commitment, to match words with actions. Ukraine is counting on us. Finally, as we work to achieve accountability, we must also do right by the survivors of sexual violence. They urgently need improved and expanded comprehensive service provisions, including sexual and reproductive health services, medical and specialized mental health services, legal assistance, and livelihood support. All of this work needs to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed. Above all, it must give survivors hope. Together, let us take on the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. Let us demand accountability and justice for survivors and provide the resources to see it through. And let us do everything in our power to prevent more violence and end Russia's unconscionable war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank Special Representative Patton and the other briefers for their briefings. As the conflict in Ukraine enters its fourth month, it has taken a heavy toll on the Ukrainian people, and the security risks faced by women and children are particularly worrisome. Parties to the conflict should comply with international law and take measures to protect civilians from all forms of violence, including sexual violence against women and children, women and girls, and human trafficking. People affected by violence should have timely access to medical, psychological, and social services. And parties to the conflict should ensure that hospitals and other civilian facilities are protected from attack. The United Nations and the Ukrainian government signed a framework agreement last month to help survivors of sexual violence and prevent human trafficking, with a view to providing effective protection for vulnerable groups such as women and children. The use of sexual violence as a tactic of war is a serious crime, and any allegations should be investigated impartially on the basis of facts. Since the outbreak of the conflict, 6.8 million Ukrainian people have crossed the border into neighboring countries for refuge, the vast majority of whom are women and children. China appreciates the humanitarian spirit shown by Ukraine's neighboring countries in providing safe shelter and basic livelihood for women and children refugees. Meanwhile, a growing number of cases of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and abuse targeting women and children refugees are disturbing. China calls for immediate international cooperation to identify and punish relevant criminal acts and to resolutely stop secondary victimization of women and children. The Office of the Special Representative of Madam Patton, UN Women, UNICEF, UNHCR, UNODC, OHCHR, and other international agencies should strengthen monitoring and analysis and provide professional and technical support to combat human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and abuse against refugees. Mr. President, eliminating sexual violence and human trafficking in conflict is not the end of our efforts. Only through ceasefire and restoring peace can the trauma of conflict on women and children be fundamentally avoided. The international community should work together to promote peace talks and encourage Russia and Ukraine back to the negotiation track. We hope the upcoming meeting between Russia, Ukraine, the UN, and Turkey will help the parties gradually build mutual trust while resolving the food issue in Ukraine. Neither providing weapons nor imposing sanctions and pressure will solve the problem, but will only perpetuate and expand the conflict. People in Ukraine and other developing countries have no reason to pay the price for geopolitical and bloc confrontations. At a time when human destiny is shared and global security is indivisible, no country can or should seek its own absolute security at the expense of the security of others. And international and regional security cannot and should not be guaranteed by strengthening military blocs and cutting off supply chain and industry chain. China once again calls on parties concerned to put international and regional peace and security first and play a constructive role in the proper resolution of the crisis in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
President. The gendered impact of conflict is of importance to peace and security and must continue to engage the attention of the global community in order that appropriate and tailored responses are provided to the several women and girls who unfortunately fall victim to those actions that constitute both a violation of their rights and international law. We are therefore grateful to Special Representative Pramila Patton, Natalia Kaborska, and Sherry Rollins-Westing for their briefings and for drawing attention to the unfortunate development of conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking in Ukraine, and more importantly, on the protection, assistance, and support being provided to the women and girls. 2 months ago in this very chamber, members of the Security Council and the wider UN membership were briefed by Ms. Patton during the open debate on conflict-related sexual violence, with an emphasis on accountability as a form of prevention. At that open debate, Ukraine was listed among conflict environments where the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence remained a chilling reality for many. Today, as Ukraine takes center stage in our discussions on conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking, we, who are entrusted with the details of the heartbreaking circumstances, owe it to victims and survivors to channel our dissatisfaction into action. We are reminded of our obligation as an international community to ensure that prevention, accountability, and a survivor-centered approach, which are at the heart of Resolution 2467, are not reduced to mere rhetoric, but are translated into real and tangible action on the ground. Ghana condemns all acts of sexual violence and human trafficking in Ukraine, including as a weapon of war, and stresses the need to hold perpetrators accountable. We reiterate our support for all ongoing accountability efforts, including investigations by the Ukrainian authorities, civil society organizations, and the International Criminal Court, among others. We further express our support for global calls to designate such acts as war crimes and submit that conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking should be treated as a basis for targeted sanctions against culpable actors, in keeping with the importance this Council attaches to accountability and ending impunity. Ghana is appreciative of the efforts of all humanitarian and aid agencies present in Ukraine, as well as the member states who have responded to the call for real action and continue to offer a hand of hope in parts of the country where it is needed the most. Training and capacity building for UN field and humanitarian workers, civil society organizations, local women groups, and media organizations in Ukraine are absolutely essential in ensuring that such entities are adequately equipped to provide sufficient sensitization against stigma. Dealing with the problem of stigmatization would encourage an increasing number of victims not only to report violations against them, but also support justice delivery on their behalf by testifying and staying engaged throughout the prosecution processes. In accordance with Resolution 2475, the UN must urgently reduce the risk of trafficking through the provision of effective assistance and protections to refugees and internally displaced persons without discrimination, in particular on grounds of race, gender, disability, or other status, recognizing that discrimination and racism may increase vulnerability to trafficking. No child in Ukraine should endure the horrible experience of being trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation. We urge all relevant UN agencies to ensure that child protection systems in Ukraine are continuously and adequately resourced. There is also a crucial need to ensure access to safe accommodation and enhance the protection of displaced and refugee children, taking into consideration their best interests to prevent them from being trafficked. It is important to conflicts occur, innocent civilians are often exposed to unspeakable physical, mental, environmental, and economic damage with very little hope for restoration. When sexual violence and human trafficking are introduced into this already toxic cocktail, victims experience an agony most of us can never imagine. A ceasefire is most urgent now to eliminate the conditions within which these unbridled and gross violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights abuses are manifested. Consequently, we reiterate the call on the Russian Federation to unconditionally withdraw its forces from the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine, and for the two parties to commit to diplomacy and dialogue for an early and negotiated settlement of the dispute. We believe that through a meaningful and sustained engagement centered on the principles of the Charter, international law, and the norms that facilitate peaceful coexistence and assure stability, the parties will better be equipped to address their mutual security concerns. In concluding, we urge the sustained engagement of the Council on this important matter towards ensuring freedom from sexual oppression and accountability for all acts of impunity against women and girls in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the three briefers for their important statements. Norway condemns in the strongest terms Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, a blatant violation of the UN Charter. Russia must stop the war and withdraw its troops immediately. We reiterate our demand that civilians must be protected and international humanitarian law fully respected and implemented. We're appalled by the forced deportations of Ukrainian citizens, including children, to Russia, Russian-controlled territories, and Belarus. We call for the restoration of family links, the immediate release of Ukrainian citizens, and their relocation to safety in government-held areas of Ukraine. President, the war has a gendered impact. It affects women and men, girls and boys, and members of the LGBTI community differently. Let me highlight 3 issues in this regard. First, attacks on healthcare institutions and staff are denying people, including women who are pregnant or in labor, safe access to sexual and reproductive health services. Second, the high number of survivor accounts of rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Children will be born of war. Their rights and well-being and that of their mothers must be ensured. And third, the high risk of trafficking as displaced people seek safety across borders. These violations and risks must be addressed. And in response, Norway has increased our support to UNFPA and other humanitarian actors that provide sexual and reproductive health services. We underline the importance of gender and age-differentiated responses to meet the needs of the civilian population, including Ukrainian IDPs and refugees. This must include access to mental health and psychosocial support, and sexual and reproductive health services for all, regardless of the gender indicated in their passport. Also, unaccompanied Ukrainian children are in a particularly vulnerable situation. Child protection services must be ensured. But first and foremost, we must take steps to prevent sexual and gender-based violence, including trafficking, from happening. And we welcome the agreed framework for cooperation between Ukraine and the UN on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. Engaging and supporting women human rights defenders and civil society in our responses is key. We insist on a survivor-centered approach. It is vital for the survivors, their communities, and Ukraine as a whole to be able to overcome the trauma and stigma that has been brought on them by this war, and to move forward together. Atrocities must be investigated, and those responsible held accountable. We support, therefore, the ongoing investigations, including the work of the ICC and the Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine. Expertise on conflict-related sexual violence, gender, and children's rights are crucial in these processes. And we underline the critical importance of strong and independent human rights institutions and accountability mechanisms in Ukraine. There must be zero tolerance for sexual and gender-based violence and trafficking, and no impunity for perpetrators. Accountability is vital to ensure justice for the survivors and prevent future sexual and gender-based violations everywhere. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, let me thank the briefers, Pramila Patin, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Skarbowska, and Ms. Westin, for their valuable accounts of the situation in Ukraine with reference to sexual violence and human trafficking. As the conflict in Ukraine has entered its 4th month, the full extent of its humanitarian consequences are still being assessed by the international community. We know for sure that the conflict has caused immense suffering for both the people directly affected by military action and for the civilians fleeing confrontation. In the wider context of destruction and gross violations of human rights brought about by the war, we take note with great concern of reports of alleged cases of sexual violence directed against women and girls in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. The numbers reported are alarming and suggest that rape is being systematically deployed as a weapon of war. Brazil reiterates its calls for urgent independent investigations. It is admittedly difficult to document sexual violence because often victims do not want to speak about it. The insufficiency of reports further contributes to the sense of impunity that surrounds such war crimes. The use of gender-based violence as a weapon of war, as well as a tool of intimidation and social control in conflict situations, is unacceptable. Such crimes are often used to humiliate and punish innocent civilians. It is well documented that sexual violence destroys the social fabric of communities and inflicts long-lasting psychological trauma in its victims. In its aftermath, the stigmatization and discrimination of survivors can endure and contribute to further gender inequality. Perpetrators of such acts, be they agents of the state or not, should be held accountable for committing clear violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law. Such abhorrent acts are prohibited both in times of war and peace. The proper investigation and prosecution of sexual violence cases in Ukraine are necessary, not just as a means of reparation, but also of delivering justice. As experience shows us, the delivery of justice in such cases is also an important tool to consolidate peace in post-conflict situations. Since the outbreak of the conflict, nearly 15 million people have been displaced and humanitarian needs continue to soar. Unfortunately, human traffickers and criminal networks may take advantage of such movement of people, women and children in its majority. Such criminals attempt to exploit refugees' vulnerability and lure them with false promises of free transport, accommodation, employment, or other forms of assistance. Although we do not know the exact figures of how many victims have already fallen prey to traffickers and abusers, the risks are clear and deserve attention from the international community. As the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection of UNHCR, Gillian Triggs, acknowledged last April, states have the duty to prevent predatory individuals and criminal organizations from profiting from the situation. We praise UNHCR for launching an awareness-raising campaign among refugees, distributing printed material with information on how they can protect themselves and report incidents of sexual misconduct or criminal activity. Increased reports of sexual violence and human trafficking, as well as the growing number of refugees and internally displaced people, reveal that the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. In order to prevent those atrocities in the region and in other countries, it is crucial that we engage in providing effective strategies to reduce unsafe and irregular routes and to promote the sustainable and safe legal pathways for those in need of protection. It is our duty and responsibility to ensure that those fleeing hostilities are appropriately received and cared for. For this purpose, Brazil has introduced special humanitarian visas for Ukrainian nationals and stateless persons affected by the conflict in Ukraine who wish to live and work in Brazil. Brazilian embassies in Bratislava, Budapest, Bucharest, Prague, and Warsaw have been granting those visas since March, a policy that has previously benefited nationals of Afghanistan, Syria, and Haiti. This is an example of Brazil's unshakable commitment to human rights and the protection of the most vulnerable. This Council has already failed in preventing the outbreak of conflict and ensuring the cessation of hostilities. It must not fail in repudiating sexual crimes and human trafficking. Immediate investigation by relevant international bodies is called for, including by the Committee for Inquiry for Ukraine of the Human Rights Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict and Under-Secretary General Ms. Pramila Patten for her remarks. I also thank civil society briefers, Ms. Natalia Karbowska and Ms. Sherry Rollin Weston for their insights. Mr. President, in the last 3 decades, the international community has played an important role in fixing accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, thereby sending out a strong message that sexual violence must find no place in the civilized world. Despite such progress, it is indeed distressing that sexual violence in armed conflict situations continue unabated amid a culture of impunity as a tactic of war, torture, and terror in armed conflicts, especially by non-state actors. Primarily, national governments have the important responsibility for prosecuting and deterring such crimes in conflict situations on their territories, even if these are committed by non-state actors. The UN, upon request of member states, must assist national authorities in developing capabilities to strengthen their national legal frameworks and related structures for speedy investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. We also support effective cooperation and appropriate mechanisms to combat illegal migration and human trafficking. Mr. President, India continues to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation in Ukraine and reiterates its call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to hostilities. The conflict in Ukraine has resulted in loss of lives and countless miseries for its people, particularly for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. We support all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict and alleviate the suffering of the people of Ukraine. We also call for resumption of talks between Ukraine and the Russian Federation to end the conflict. The conflict is having destabilizing effect with broader regional and global implications. The increasing oil prices and shortage of food grains and fertilizers is having disproportionate impact on the global south, in particular on developing countries. The developed world needs to do much more to alleviate the adverse impact this is making on day-to-day lives of the people living in vulnerable countries. India is committed to work constructively in mitigating the adverse impact of the conflict on food security and in ensuring that vulnerable countries have sufficient cushion against fluctuations in the global market. In order to manage our own overall food security and support the needs of neighboring and other vulnerable developing countries, we had announced some measures that allow for wheat exports based on approvals of those countries who are required to meet their food security demands. Such a policy will ensure that countries in need are given priority. In this context, it is necessary for all of us to adequately appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility when it comes to food grains. We have already seen, to our regret, how these principles were disregarded in the case of COVID-19 vaccines. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. India has been providing financial assistance as well as supplying food grains to neighboring countries which are facing the consequences of the Ukraine conflict. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements. Mr. President, we reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, that is, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. Let me conclude by reaffirming that the contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by thanking SRSG Patton, Ms. Karbowska, and Ms. Rollins-Westin for their powerful briefings. I also welcome the representative of Ukraine and European Council President Michel amongst the participants in this meeting. President, Friday marked 100 days since Russia launched its illegal war against Ukraine. During that time, we have witnessed death and destruction on a scale not seen in Europe since World War II. Thousands have been killed or injured. Over 6.6 million people have fled Ukraine. And millions inside the country remain displaced, stranded in conflict-affected areas, and in dire need of humanitarian support. As we have heard, women and girls are the most affected. We have seen evidence of serious breaches of international law, including atrocities in places such as Bucha and Irpin, and attacks on schools, hospitals, railway stations, apartment buildings, journalists, even on Kyiv while the Secretary General was visiting. We have seen a disturbing increase in conflict-related sexual violence, including horrific reports of rape and sexual violence committed by Russian armed forces, and a significant increase in human trafficking. Russia's actions, including destroying or blockading key ports, have also exacerbated one of the most severe worldwide food crises in recent history. President, we applaud the work of the UN and the humanitarian and civil society organizations seeking to address the suffering wrought by this war, including efforts to secure grain exports from Ukraine. The United Kingdom is committed to supporting these efforts in every way we can. We have pledged $500 million to help Ukraine. This includes funding to the UN and to civil society organizations helping survivors of gender-based violence, including sexual violence. Accountability is vital to upholding the rule of law and the rights of all states. The United Kingdom is assisting with the important task of evidence collection and preservation, including on sexual violence. We are collaborating closely with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and have deployed specialist UK war crimes and conflict-related sexual violence experts to Poland to provide support. At the open debate on the 13th of April, we launched the Murad Code, designed to support safe evidence collection from survivors of sexual violence. A Ukrainian language translation has been shared with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General. We continue to look at all international options to tackle these heinous crimes and hold perpetrators to account. President, this war is appalling and unjustified, as appalling and unjustified after 100 days as it was on its first. Russia is ignoring all our calls for peace, continuing attacks in eastern Ukraine, and yet again striking Kyiv this weekend. We must not allow Russia to normalize illegal aggression with its disinformation, distraction, and lies. We must instead demand that Russia ends the suffering it is causing. This means immediately ceasing its invasion and withdrawing its forces, as the Secretary General, members of this Council, and the General Assembly have demanded, and as the International Court of Justice has ordered. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. Et je donne la parole au représentant du Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, prenant la parole pour la première fois depuis le début de votre magistère, je voudrais vous féliciter pour votre présidence du Conseil et vous remercier pour l'initiative de cet important débat sur les violences sexuelles et la traite des personnes en lien avec la situation en Ukraine. Je remercie la représentante spéciale Pramila Patten pour son exposé édifiant. Je remercie également Madame Natalia Karboska et Madame Sherry Rawlings-Westin pour leurs témoignages respectifs. Monsieur le Président, en prenant la parole ce matin devant ce Conseil, nos pensées vont vers les populations qui, en Ukraine ou dans les pays voisins de l'Ukraine, sont en proie aux affres de la guerre qui prévaut depuis une centaine de jours. Nous leur exprimons notre solidarité dans les moments de détresse qu'elles endurent. Je rends hommage au nom de mon pays aux femmes et aux hommes qui sont engagés à leur côté dans le cadre des missions humanitaires, en vue d'édulcorer l'atrocité du quotidien des survivants de la guerre. Nous voulons vous dire que l'aide humanitaire, si vitale en pareille circonstance, doit pouvoir être fournie sans entrave aux populations qui en ont besoin, sans politisation aucune, dans des conditions de sécurité et de respect garanties par le droit international humanitaire. Chers collègues, les statistiques du dernier rapport de situation d'OCHA sur la guerre en Ukraine sont effrayantes. Elle confirme les prévisions d'un bilan qui s'alourdit à mesure que les combats sur le terrain s'intensifient. Les civils continuent de payer le plus lourd tribut des hostilités. En effet, plus de 7 millions de personnes déplacées à l'intérieur du pays, environ 6,8 millions de réfugiés.
And approximately
Nous sommes très préoccupés par
million
les
of them are
allégations de violences
refugees. We're
sexuelles
very
et sexistes,
concerned at allegations of
particulièrement à
sexual
l'égard des
violence
femmes et des enfants,
that persist,
ainsi que
especially
les témoignages
against women
persistants
and
sur
children,
le
as well
développement
as
des réseaux de
persistent
trafic de
reports
personnes.
of growing
Nous saluons à
networks
cet égard
of trafficking
les actions
in
menées
persons.
par les
We
organisations et
welcome
agences
here
spécialisées des
the
Nations Unies
initiatives
pour
of
prévenir
United
et
Nations
endiguer ces menaces
specialized
et atteintes graves
agencies to
aux
prevent
droits
and
humains.
curb threats and
Nous
serious
saluons
human
le
rights
travail de veille
violations. We welcome
et de
the
sensibilisation
monitoring and
qui est accompli
outreach
par le
carried
bureau de
out
Mme
by
Patel
Ms. Patton's
à cet
office.
effet et espérons que
And it
l'accord
is
de
our
coopération
hope
signé
that the
avec le
cooperation
gouvernement
agreement
ukrainien
signed with the Ukrainian
permettra
government
une meilleure
will
prévention
enable
de ces crimes ainsi
better
qu'un
prevention
renforcement
of such
de la
crimes
réponse
as well as
opérationnelle.
stronger operational response.
Nous saluons également
We also
les
welcome
dispositifs mis en
the
place
mechanisms
par le Fonds des Nations Unies
set
pour la
up
population,
by the United Nations,
mais aussi par l'Organisation internationale
UNFPA,
pour
rather,
les
but
migrations,
also the
en vue
International
d'apporter
Organization for
des
Migration,
réponses
to
appropriées à
provide
court,
appropriate
moyen et
responses
long terme,
in the medium
aussi
and
bien au
long
plan de la
term,
prise
as
en
well
charge
as to
médicale
provide
que
medical
juridique.
and legal assistance.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
il est fondamental
the point
de
must
souligner
be
que les conventions
forcefully
internationales
made that
protégeant
all
les
parties to the
civils dans les
conflict
combats
are
et
bound
les résolutions
by the international
pertinentes
conventions
de ce
protecting
Conseil,
civilians,
au nombre
as
desquelles
well as the
les
relevant
résolutions
resolutions of this
1820
council,
et
including
1835
resolutions
qui condamnent les violences
1820
sexuelles
and
contre les femmes,
1325, which condemn sexual
l'utilisation du
violence
viol
against women,
comme
the
arme de
use
guerre
of rape as a
et
weapon
reconnaissent
of
les
war,
violences sexuelles comme une
and
menace à part
which
entière à la sécurité.
recognize sexual violence as a
résolution
threat in its own
engage
right to
toutes les parties
security.
belligérantes.
This again is
La communauté
binding on
internationale
all parties to the
doit
conflict.
s'assurer que
The
les
international
violences
community
sexuelles,
must
la
ensure
traite
that
des
sexual
personnes et
violence,
toutes les autres
trafficking in
atteintes aux droits
persons, and
humains
all
durant les
other
conflits
human
armés
rights violations in the
puissent faire
context of armed
l'objet
conflict
d'enquêtes
are
indépendantes et
subject
impartiales
to
afin
independent
d'établir
and
les
impartial
faits et les
inquiries so as to
responsabilités.
ascertain the facts and
Les
attribute
réseaux mafieux
responsibility.
de traite et d'exploitation
Organized
sexuelle
crime
qui
networks
opèrent sur
of
les routes de
trafficking in
l'exode
persons
ou
and
sur les lieux
sexual
d'accueil
exploitation which
doivent
are
être
operating on
neutralisés
escape
et leurs
routes
auteurs
or
doivent
in places of
répondre
refuge
de leurs
must be
crimes.
neutralized and the
À cet
perpetrators
effet,
must answer for
la
their crimes.
coordination
For
entre
this
les
reason,
différentes
coordination
organisations
between the
impliquées
various
doit être renforcée.
organizations involved
L'échange et
must
le
be
partage des
strengthened.
informations
There must be
doit
more
être accru
sharing of
afin
information
de laisser le
so
moins
as to
d'espace possible aux réseaux
hamstring
criminels
as far as
qui
possible
profitent de la
those
détresse des
criminal
populations
networks
fuyant
taking
les zones de
advantage of the
guerre.
distress of people
Les risques
fleeing
d'exploitation
war
par le
zones.
travail illégal
The risks
ou
of
d'enrôlement
exploitation
dans les réseaux pédophiles
through
ou encore
illegal
d'adoption
labor
illégale
networks or recruitment
seront
into
sans doute
pedophile
fortement réduits
networks or
si les
even
réseaux de
illegal
communication,
adoption will
les
no
moyens
doubt be
d'action
reduced
et le
considerably
financement de ces
if the
derniers
communications
sont asséchés.
networks, means of action and
Monsieur le
financing
Président,
of these
je
criminal
voudrais
networks
ici,
are cut
une
off
fois de
at the
plus,
root.
donner écho
Mr.
à la
President,
situation
once
des
again,
personnes qui
I
fuient
wanted
la
to
guerre, en
hark back to the
particulier de
situation
nombreux
faced by
ressortissants
those who are fleeing the
africains.
war, especially
En
many
effet, nous
African
continuons
nationals.
de recevoir des témoignages
Indeed, we continue to
insoutenables
receive
de plusieurs
unbearable
d'entre eux qui sont
first-person accounts
exposés
of
à des mauvais
from
traitements
several of them who
durant
are
leur
exposed to
exode du
maltreatment
fait de leur
during their
origine.
escape because of their origin.
Depuis le début de la guerre en
Since the
Ukraine,
outbreak of the war in
nous
Ukraine,
faisons écho
we
de la
have
stigmatisation
repeatedly
de nombreux
mentioned
ressortissants
the
africains.
stigmatization of many African
Il ne s'agit pas
nationals.
seulement d'une
This is
question
not
de
only
couleur
a
de peau,
question of skin
mais
color, but
d'humanité,
also one of humanity, of the
d'universalité de la détresse
universality of
et du
distress and the
respect
respect
que nous avons
that
pour les
we
nobles
have
valeurs
for
des
the
Nations
noble
Unies,
values of the United
pour les peuples
Nations
du monde.
and for the
J'allais dire
peoples of the
tous les
world.
peuples du
And by
monde.
this I mean all the
Il est évident
peoples of the
qu'en
world.
situation de guerre,
It is obvious that in
toutes les
wartime,
peines
all
doivent être
suffering must
considérées
be given
avec
the
le même
same
sérieux.
attention.
Parce que la douleur
Because
n'a pas de
pain
faciès.
has no
Chaque larme de
face. It
douleur
affects us all.
doit activer notre émotion et notre
This
instinct
should
de
touch us
condamnation
all and
sans que soit
prompt us to
ausculté au
condemn
préalable
it
la
without
couleur
having to
des
check
yeux dont elle coule. L'indifférence devant une telle misère humaine est aussi indécente et insupportable que l'odieuse discrimination elle-même. Au moment du bilan,
When all is said and done,
Africains
the ordeal suffered by young Africans fleeing the war in Ukraine, who are discriminated against, humiliated, and treated incomprehensibly in human beings should not be forgotten. When all is said and done, we must remember the deafening silence of some and the selective advocacy of all those who know how to make themselves heard or who are able to act but who remain passive in the face of the cries of distress of young Africans who were overlooked by the protection mechanisms and found themselves even more exposed to the risks of exploitation. Mr. President, as we have just heard, and we heard this from Ms. Patton, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is all the more worrying and requires urgent action to respond to the significant needs of the civilian populations. We owe women and children a response because they are caught in a vice between warring parties. We owe a response to those who are abused and exploited. We owe a response to all these scattered families who have lost dignity, and our response must go above and beyond our tribal rifts and respond to the suffering of all victims. My country calls for a ceasefire and the opening of humanitarian corridors everywhere, such as to provide humanitarian assistance in optimal security conditions. In closing, on behalf of my country, I wish to reiterate our call for genuine, good faith negotiations to put an end to the war. It goes without saying that the most effective means of eliminating the risks of sexual or gender-based violence and exploitation is to put an end to the conflict. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Gabon pour sa déclaration, and I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank SRSG Pramila Patten, Ms. Natalia Kabowska, and Ms. Sherry Rollins-Weston for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine and the permanent representatives of the affected countries in the region. This morning, it is with a heavy heart that the Kenya delegation sends its condolences to the people and government of Nigeria for the brutal murder of dozens of worshippers at St. Francis Catholic Church in the town of Owo in Ondo State. Such an act of terrorism is a crime against humanity, which we condemn in the strongest terms. It invites its council to redouble its efforts to ensure terrorist groups are met with the strongest condemnation and opposition. Mr. President, wars of aggression are a transgression of international law that opens the floodgate to serious violations against civilians, particularly when those are wars that breach the UN Charter. Even as we justly condemn war crimes, we must not forget that war itself is the greatest crime. Sexual violence against women, children, and men is the frequent outcome of war, and it is also used deliberately and sometimes systematically as a weapon of war. We recognize with the deepest concern the women, girls, and boys in Ukraine who have suffered this uniquely horrifying crime. We condemn their violation and the violation of international law, the laws of war, the UN Charter, and the most basic human decency. We call on all military commanders to ensure that those responsible for these atrocities are held accountable. Soldiers in the field should be subject to severe discipline for abusing civilians or captured combatants. Political leaders should also be aware that using ideological labeling on entire populations increases the risks that rank-and-file soldiers will commit atrocities. Leaders should, in all public communications, uphold the human dignity, worth, and equality of the entirety of the people of Ukraine. We urge all concerned UN agencies and those in Ukraine and neighboring countries to do their utmost to deliver medical and psychosocial support to the survivors of sexual violence and trafficking. More should be done to ensure humanitarian corridors and safety from military targeting for the millions who remain vulnerable in besieged cities and villages. We say this fully aware that the truest protection is the stopping of the war and the respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. In the meantime, there is a crucial need for effective cross-border coordination between border security personnel, early warning mechanisms, and national and regional women protection advisors, as well as humanitarian actors to protect those in danger of violations. In this regard, we commend the signing of the UN framework in early May to assist survivors of sexual violence, whose purview also covers the prevention of conflict-related trafficking amid rising displacement. We also commend all individuals, institutions, and governments that are helping in every possible way. We especially thank UN bodies and the agencies including OCHA, UN Women, UNICEF, UNHCR, UNFPA, and UNDP for their reports and action briefs highlighting the plight of civilians, especially women and children, and spearheading the UN's response. We also applaud the brave women of Ukraine that are fighting for peace and for their country. We recognize with admiration the brave women who are leading in government and civil society. We are further pleased to see the role of women as agents of change and urge their participation in decision-making at all levels in all aspects, including diplomatic efforts to find lasting peace and security in Europe and globally. Mr. President, I must again bring up the plight of Africans who are trapped in the war. Unfortunately, we continue to see reports of racial discrimination directed at people of African descent, who, like other fleeing Ukrainians, are also seeking safety in Europe. We recently heard Gerald Eziani's heartfelt story of his experience while crossing the border from Ukraine to Hungary and then to Berlin. Though aware of his rights and the laws outlined in the UN Charter which allow him the right of passage, having been a valid resident of Ukraine, he experienced discrimination on the train where he was requested to disembark by 15 to 20 German police officers under claims that he was not born in Ukraine, which would demand that he undergo further processing to leave. Given these appalling justifications, all the black people on the train were requested to disembark and held for 23 hours, where they endured unjust and inhumane treatment by law enforcement. It is only for us to repeat that people of African descent are equally human and deserving of equal protection and facilitation in line with the UN Charter. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine continues to worsen the food insecurity in many countries, particularly in the global south. As a mitigating measure, we support the call by the WFP for the urgent opening of Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea to allow for the export of food. The humanitarian and developmental response must leave no country or region behind. We commend the efforts of the African Union chairperson and the chair of the African Union Commission for their engagement of leaders who are in a position to open up the movement of food from Ukraine and to the world. Mr. President, in closing, I reaffirm Kenya's support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine, and our continued call for the prioritization of dialogue as the only plausible avenue to resolve serious disputes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I'd like to join others in thanking Ms. Patton, Ms. Karbowska, and Ms. Rowlands-Weston for their very insightful briefings. I also welcome the participation of Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, as well as Ukraine in this meeting. Before the latest crisis in Ukraine, the world was already in the midst of the worst refugee crisis since World War II. This has, in turn, been the cause of almost unfathomable levels of sexual violence and human trafficking. In 2016, the International Labour Organization estimated that 28.7 million women and girls around the world were in a condition of forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, slavery, and trafficking. The Secretary General's report on human trafficking in 2020 noted that 70% of all identified trafficking victims were women and girls, 77% of whom were trafficked for sexual exploitation. My region, the Middle East, has been at the epicenter of this crisis for more than a decade, with millions displaced and exploited. The conflict in Ukraine is therefore making an already horrifying global crisis worse. In just over 100 days, almost 14 million people have been displaced, more than a quarter of Ukraine's population. The majority of them are women and children. We have already seen disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence and of women and children falling victim to organized criminal gangs operating human trafficking rings. As we have heard today, this conflict demands a serious, gender-centered international response that prioritizes the needs and safety of women and children in times of conflict. We also note with concern and concur with our colleagues from Kenya and Gabon that all refugees must be treated equally and without racism. Following the topic chosen for today's discussion, I'd like to focus on the following points. First, we commend the framework of cooperation that SRSG Patton's office signed with the government of Ukraine on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. Cooperation between the UN and relevant authorities in Ukraine and their human trafficking task force in areas including improved access for survivors of sexual violence to health and social services is critical. We support the SRSG's plan to deploy an expert on trafficking to cooperate with authorities in Ukraine and in neighboring countries because we believe that it will help mitigate the horrific exploitation of women and children across the region. Initiatives like this are positive and necessary steps and can boost the capacity and efforts of neighboring countries to prevent exploitation and combat trafficking. We note Ms. Patton's message that a regional compact is urgently required and that the UN Security Council should continue to lend its support on the humanitarian context of this conflict, and the UAE supports both suggestions. Second, we already know how essential yet difficult it is to collect sex disaggregated data in conflict situations, including to better understand the impact of the conflict on human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence. Initiatives like the rapid gender analysis carried out by UN Women and CARE International provide insight on the gender dynamics of the conflict in Ukraine and are the type of analysis that can guide a better and more tailored response to the needs of Ukrainian women and girls. They should continue to be well funded. Third, the conflict continues to undermine food security globally, which disproportionately affects women and girls. When mostly men take part in conflict, it is women who are forced to put food on the table for their families by any means necessary. We know that food insecurity exacerbates vulnerabilities and can result in women facing violence and exploitation as they seek to support their families, especially in rural areas. Because of these knock-on effects, this Council must keep global food insecurity exacerbated by this conflict at the top of our agenda. To that end, the UAE commends the Secretary General for his efforts to facilitate the shipment of grain from Ukrainian ports and encourages all ongoing efforts. Mr. President, there are many actions that can be taken to mitigate, prevent, and respond to conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking in Ukraine, but there is only one real way to stop it. That would be to end the conflict with a diplomatic solution in which women are full, equal, and meaningful participants, included in all mediation and dialogue efforts. We hope to see that happen, and with urgency, in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the UAE for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I would like to welcome the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, to the Chamber today, and as always to welcome our colleague, the Ambassador of Ukraine. Sincere thanks to our briefers this morning, to SRSG Pramila Patton, and to Natalia Karbowska and Sherry Rowlands-Weston. Thank you very much. We're grateful for your deeply sobering accounts of the suffering and destruction caused by Russia's senseless and illegal war in Ukraine, which we now all know has surpassed 100 days. Every day since then, we've been watching the fallout of this abhorrent war, civilians attacked and killed, schools and hospitals targeted, mass displacement and family separation. And the subject that brings us to this table today, conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking. Let me be clear, this is no special military operation. This is an illegal war causing intentional damage and suffering. President, over 15 million people have now fled their homes. The vast majority, as we know, are women and children. This speed and scale of displacement is unheard of in modern times. When the Russian Federation further invaded Ukraine in late February, the alarm about human trafficking was raised immediately. We know that conflict and displacement exacerbates human trafficking. We know that it provides fertile ground for those who trade in human beings, organized criminal networks looking to take advantage of the most vulnerable in our societies, as was sadly and very graphically highlighted this morning by Pramila Patten, the Special Representative. Civil society, national authorities and UN agencies on the ground mobilised quickly to respond, to raise awareness and to provide information to refugees and training to service providers and border police. I want to express our sincere gratitude today for their work. It has without doubt prevented harm. But more needs to be done to ensure prevention efforts are robust. As the war rages on, the vulnerability of those fleeing has only increased. Members of marginalised groups, like unaccompanied children and those with disabilities, face particular risks. The groundswell of volunteers who have mobilised to support those fleeing represents humanity at its best. It speaks to the foundation upon which human rights and indeed this UN was built, that all people are born with inherent dignity. Yet we must ensure rigorous vetting and registration procedures are in place to prevent exploitation and to protect against trafficking. As highlighted by UN Special Rapporteur Siobhan Mullally and others, expanded international protection measures and safe migration routes are also essential in reducing risks of trafficking. In welcoming more than 33,000 Ukrainians to Ireland under the EU's Temporary Protection Directive, we have sought to mitigate such risks. President, we also know that conflict and displacement exacerbate sexual and gender-based violence. This Council has heard of the horrifying reports of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers against women and girls, against men and boys. Rape is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It is an act which may constitute a war crime and which leaves victims and their communities with lifelong effects and trauma. As SRSG Patten said earlier, even one case of such abuse is one case too many. This Council has already condemned conflict-related sexual violence and recognised that it can constitute a war crime. But now is the time for the international community to do more and to ensure that such crimes do not go unpunished. As Special Representative Pramila Patten stated while in Kiev, international law will not be an empty promise. It cannot be. The efforts underway to gather evidence and to investigate these crimes, including through the UN Framework for Cooperation, will help bring those responsible to account. We fully support SRSG Patten in her work in the context of the framework agreement with the government of Ukraine, and we echo the calls she made this morning for cooperation from the Russian Federation. There will be justice for victims and survivors. President, reports of an increase in domestic violence in Ukraine is also of deep concern. Survivors of gender-based violence now face a double crisis, as services are not fully available to provide protection and respond to their needs. In addition to justice, all survivors of sexual and gender-based violence and of trafficking deserve protection and assistance. Comprehensive survivor-centered services must be provided at every stage, within Ukraine, on the borders, in transit countries, and by host countries. This means taking into account the particular needs of groups and individuals in vulnerable situations. Sexual and reproductive health services and psychosocial supports must be prioritised. Let me conclude, President, by speaking directly to the Russian Federation. I have no doubt this war will end. They all do. Light always overcomes darkness. If you have any compassion for the millions of victims, respect for international law, and can still show humanity, please stop this war now. Stop the senseless suffering. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President.
Благодарим докладчику за
We thank the
предоставленную
briefers for the
информацию.
information they provided.
У меня нет перевода здесь, я не слышу. Послушай. Благодарим докладчику
We
за
thank the briefers for
предоставленную
the information that
информацию.
they have provided.
Раскручивание обвинений
of
в совершении
accusations
российскими
of Russian service
военнослужащими
personnel
преступлений
committing
сексуального
crimes of a
характера
sexual nature
с самого начала
since the very
нашей
beginning
специальной
of
военной
our
операции
special
на
military
Украине
operation in Ukraine
стало излюбленным приемом
has become a
киевского
favorite
режима и
tactic
наших
of the Kiev
западных
regime
коллег.
and our Western colleagues.
Мы все помним, как
We all
в
recall
украинских и
how in the
западных СМИ, а
Ukrainian and
также
Western media
в этом зале
and also in
наши
this
солдаты
room, our
неоднократно
soldiers were
обвиняли в
repeatedly
секс-насилии,
accused of sexual violence
ссылаясь при этом
with
на некие
reference
якобы
to
сообщения,
certain
содержащие
reports
достоверные
containing
данные.
allegedly reliable data.
Никаких доказательств при этом не
However, no
предъявлялось.
evidence was provided.
Как и сегодня мы не
Just
услышали
like
ни
today,
одного
we've not
примера
heard
со
a
стороны
single
докладчиков,
example from the
выступающих
briefers and those who've
делегаций.
taken the floor, the delegations.
Но подобные обвинения хорошо ложатся в
Similar
тщательно
allegations
создаваемый
fit very well
западными
into the image
политтехнологами
that was
образ
meticulously
российских
created by
солдат
Western
как
political
зверей
scientists
неотесных
of
варваров,
Russian soldiers as beasts
точно так же, как это
and
делали
coarse
геббельсовцы на
barbarians, just like
завершающем этапе
Goebbels
Второй мировой
people
войны.
did towards the end of the Second World War.
Наверное, помните, как
You'll
поспред
probably
Украины
recall
по
how
той
the
же
PR of Ukraine,
нацистской
using
методичке
this
рассказывал
same
нам, как
Nazi
солдаты
method,
России
told us how
воровали,
Russia's
уходя из Бучи,
soldiers,
бытовую
when they were
технику и
leaving Bucha,
унитазы,
looted
потому
household
что в
goods and
России у
toilets
многих
because
нет
in
унитазов.
Russia a lot of people don't
Это
have
цитата.
toilets. That's a quote.
Постановка в Буче, по случаю
staging in
которой
Bucha,
наши британские коллеги
on
так
the
и не
subject of which our
хотели
British colleagues
по нашей
so much
просьбе
did not
собрать
want
Совет
to convene the
Безопасности,
Security Council upon our
вообще
request,
пока оказалось апогеем этой лживой,
ended up being the apogee
бездоказательной
of this
пиар-кампании.
mendacious and unfounded
Сегодня
PR
озвучено
campaign.
столько нестыковок и
Today we've had so
опровержений
many
официальной версии,
inconsistencies
что
and
вспоминать о
refutations
ней
of the
наши
official
западные
version
партнеры уже
that our Western
остерегаются.
partners are now very cautious of mentioning it at all.
Зато бездоказательных обвинений в секс-насилии
And
меньше не
unfounded
становится, в чем
accusations
мы
of
сегодня
sexual
имели
violence
возможность
are not
убедиться.
decreasing in number, as we have seen once again
Хочу
today.
обратиться к
I
коллегам,
would like to
которые
turn to
сегодня
colleagues
особенно
that today
усердствовали на этом
have
поприще.
become particularly
Я бы
indignant on
вам
this
советовал быть
subject. I would invite you
осторожнее,
to be
ведь
cautious
за подобными
because
утверждениями Киева
for
нет
these sorts
необходимой
of
доказательной базы.
allegations by Kiev, there is absolutely no, there isn't the necessary
Лучше других
evidentiary
это на днях
basis.
доказала в
This
кавычках
was
не
proved very
кто-нибудь,
well the other
а
day,
сама
not by
украинская
just anyone,
уполномоченная
but
по правам
the
человека
Ukrainian
госпожа
ombudsperson for human
Денисова.
rights herself, Ms.
Она, что называется, перегнула
She,
палку и
as it
была
were,
уволена
did her job a
киевским
little too
режимом
well and was
с
fired by
интересной
the Ukrainian
формулировкой.
regime using interesting wording.
Непонятная концентрация
An
на
unfathomable
многочисленных
concentration
деталях
on the numerous
сексуальных
detailed
преступлений
cases of
и
sexual
изнасилования
crimes
детей
and
на
raped
оккупированных
children
территориях,
on the
которые
occupied
не могли быть
territories which could
подтверждены
not be
доказательствами.
confirmed by evidence.
Иными словами,
In other
украинский
words, the
омбудсмен
Ukrainian
бездоказательно врала всему
without
миру все это время,
evidence has been lying
что
to the entire
оказалось
world this entire
шокирующим даже
time,
для киевских
which was
властей.
shocking even for the Kiev authorities.
Те, кто по инерции
Those
смаковал
who,
сегодня
due
обвинения
to
в адрес
inertia,
российских
have once
солдат,
again made
хочу
accusations
призвать
against Russian
задуматься,
soldiers today. I
можно
would
ли
like to ask you
доверять
to think again
распространяемой Киевом
about whether you
информации,
can
точнее
rely on
дезинформации.
the information or rather
И
disinformation
дело
being
не только
circulated
в
by
одной Денисовой.
Kiev. And it's not just about
Многие случаи якобы
Denisova. A lot of
секс-насилия,
cases
которые
of
с
alleged
подачи
sexual
пропагандистской
violence,
машины
which at the
киевского
behest of the
режима
Kiev regime's propaganda machine have been repeated by many Western media outlets have already been refuted by officials or by the alleged victims themselves. For example, the authorities of Kherson reported that there is no evidence that the Russian army had used sexual violence against 11 female residents of the city, as was reported by several dubious internet platforms.
Nastya Savchishina,
a news hero known around the world under the headline "The Woman Who Was Raped and Killed by Russians Just Because She's Ukrainian," herself admitted that she was absolutely fine and it was only something to do with a somewhat strange photography session. Another example, a girl who, according to the advisor of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Alexei Arestovich, was not only abused but also mocked by Russian soldiers in Gostomel, died. However, this did not take in Gostomel, but in Mariupol, and the criminals were not Russians, but neo-Nazis from the Azov battalion, and there is evidence of this crime. While our opponents are only making baseless accusations, I will provide you with concrete examples of the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists. According to information from the Investigative Committee of Russia, a criminal case has been launched in respect of the Deputy Commander of the Firing Brigade for Educational Work of the military unit A-2777 of the 36th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Marines, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Batinsky, who committed an absolutely monstrous crime. At the beginning of April, in Mariupol, Ukrainian soldiers from this brigade detained on suspicion of separatism and put them into a cellar. Later, while drunk, Batinsky threatened her with murder and raped her in the presence of her husband. When the man tried to stop this crime from taking place, the Ukrainian soldier shot him in front of his wife. Batinsky admitted to doing this in a video interview which is widely available. On the 7th of March, near the Kommunar mine in the Donetsk region, DPR service personnel clearing mines from the area discovered a storage facility containing the bodies of 4 women. The forensic report indicated that before they were killed, they were tortured and raped. One of them was pregnant. In this area was where the Aidar Nationalist Battalion was based. On the 28th of March, Nazis from the Azov Battalion in the number 18 school building in Mariupol raped and tortured a woman to death. Her disfigured body with severed hands and a swastika burned on her belly shocked the world, and we mentioned this tragedy at the meeting of the 11th of April. Currently, on the liberated territories of Ukraine, the DPR and the LPR, work is being done to identify cases and evidence of Ukrainian army crimes. They are being documented by the investigative bodies of Russia and the Donbass republics. Mr. President, Ukrainian nationalists are infamous for their cruelty, but they also contain units whose barbarity, even in the eyes of the Kiev authorities, have exceeded all acceptable bounds. In the summer of 2015, in Ukraine, a scandal emerged around the Tornado Nationalist Battalion. The Ukrainian authorities accused its fighters of looting, torture, violence against men and women, pedophilia, murder, and the abduction of Ukrainian civilians. Many of the guilty parties were prosecuted at the time, including the battalion commander Anishenko. However, in March of this year, all of these criminals were amnestied by President Zelensky. After nearly 2,500 fighters from the neo-Nazi nationalist Azov battalion and Ukrainian army service personnel surrendered in Mariupol, having ended their pointless resistance in the Azovstal plant, an investigation of the crimes they committed is being conducted. An active role is being played in this by the residents of liberated Mariupol. Soon, the international community will learn the full truth about these crimes, including crimes of a sexual nature committed by Ukrainian nationalist units and the Ukrainian armed forces that the Kiev authorities and their Western sponsors are trying to glorify. There is numerous evidence of how these lowlifes fired at civilians, doctors, volunteers who were trying to provide assistance to the wounded. Ukrainian tanks and artillery fired at point-blank range on residential buildings, and the orders from commanders to this effect were mentioned by the Azovstal prisoners, and they also hid in a residential building from the shelling of Russian armed forces. The Azov battalion members did not allow the wounded it to leave hospitals, set fire to buildings, and intimidated and mocked civilians. In Mariupol, a burial of as many as 300 bodies was discovered, where, according to witnesses, the Azov fighters took the bodies of people that had died that they had killed in the period when they controlled the city. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine has intensified the industry of Ukrainian refugees being exploited on the territory of European countries, and Ms. Patton talked about that today. Judging by the available information, the relevant EU agencies assess the threat of trafficking of Ukrainian refugees as extremely high, given the fact that in recent years Ukraine has been among the top 5 countries in terms of the number of victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in the countries of Europe. It's important to not lose sight of this problem and to not allow violence and exploitation of refugees in European countries. And the way that the long-suffering refugee women from Ukraine are being greeted in the West is no secret to anyone. In Las Vegas, posters have emerged inviting people to casting sessions for Ukrainian strippers, and in Germany, the fast food chain KFC, in its advertising, had a sign over a bed saying, "We're happy to welcome all the chicks from Ukraine." It's hard to believe that this is just harmless advertising. Clearly, this is just the tip of the iceberg, demonstrating how great the threat of sexual exploitation of Ukrainian refugees in the West is. We have all seen the widely available horrible images on the internet of the sadistic treatment of Russian prisoners and prisoners of war by Ukrainian forces. This cruelty is something that Ukrainian nationalists are also showing towards the civilian population in Donbass and the southeast of Ukraine in general, who for them are merely separatists who in 2014 made their choice in favor of autonomy from the Maidan authorities. This same treatment is reserved for women that the Ukrainian cutthroats do not feel it necessary to spare. Mr. President, I would once again like to categorically refute any accusations against Russian service personnel of sexual violence. We roundly condemn this lie. With full responsibility, I would like to declare that the actions of Russian forces are subject to strict rules, and for torture and violence against civilians, the strictest treatment is reserved. Upholding the norms of international humanitarian law is an unquestioned priority for us. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the service personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces and the nationalist battalions. So, if you genuinely want to combat the practice of sexual crimes in Ukraine, do not allow the many facts of these crimes committed by Ukrainian forces to go unnoticed, even if political considerations might encourage you to ignore such shameful practices. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to address subjects as well that are not directly linked to the subject of today's meeting. We have taken note of the intention of the USA and the United Kingdom to supply long-range artillery and multiple-launch rocket systems to Ukraine. Leaving aside the entirely unconvincing explanations of such an irresponsible step, I would like to point out that the Kiev regime has already taken this as carte blanche to continue and intensify the shelling of civilian targets in Donbass, where, after a number of recent defeats, the Ukrainian artillery was no longer able to reach. The recent American munitions that were recently delivered to the Ukrainian armed forces are already being used to attack Donbass, including schools and other educational facilities. There are casualties, including among children, and we already spoke about this at the meeting on the 2nd of June. There is no military expediency for this sort of shelling, and Kiev knows this fully. Did you know that your countries are becoming directly complicit in the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass with all the attendant consequences? The fact that there are no limits to the use of these long-range artillery and MLRSs in the eyes of the Kiev regime is demonstrated by the recent statements of their representatives, which deviate from the assertions that there are restrictions in place that have been made from Washington and London. Against this backdrop, these statements by a number of Western officials, in particular the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, to the effect that Kiev will not use American MLRSs against targets on the territory of Russia, do not sound convincing. Thus, the head of the U.S. Secretary of State is essentially trying to legalize Ukrainian armed forces strikes on the territory of the DPR and the LPR LPR that are killing civilians, including children. In this connection, we not only reserve the right to move the line of threat that neo-Nazis pose to the Russian Federation and the Donbas republics to include the possible range of these new long-range munitions, but also to launch strikes on the centers where decisions are made, the criminal decisions are made to use these forms of weapons. I also have to note that thanks to the well-known incredible corruption of Ukrainian officials, the arms being supplied from America and Europe are openly being sold on the Ukrainian black market. A very simple internet search will show you that American Stingers are being sold for $7,000 a piece and Javelins for $30,000 each. The choice of Western firearms and ammunition is simply skyrocketing. Of course, these sales won't be missed out on by international terrorists, including those that act in Europe and America. Therefore, a warning. When your own citizens start to ask you uncomfortable questions, don't try to shift the blame onto us. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Albania. Thank you, SRSG Patton, for your insightful presentation. Ms. Skarbowska, you brought us a painful but much-needed perspective of civil society on what is going in Ukraine today. Thank you, Sherry, for the tremendous work that this Army Workshop is doing for children throughout the world. We took note of your recommendations and thank you for highlighting the critical importance of early childhood support. I welcome the participation of the President of the Council of the European Union, His Excellency Charles Michel, to this meeting, another testimony of the importance and pertinence of the issue under discussion. Dear colleagues, the so-called special operation of Russia in Ukraine, in reality an unprovoked and unjustified aggression which is turning into a war of attrition, has entered its fourth month. 103 days have passed since the unacceptable and the totally avoidable war of choice began. It continues to destroy the country with a devastating impact on the entire population. Every day that goes by with this war brings its lot of new victims, and every time we meet on this issue here, we hear about the civilians being caught in conflict, mounting significant human rights abuses and crimes committed, and the unprecedented number of displaced people. 9,000 victims have been documented by OHCHR as so far, knowing that the real number is always much higher. 6.8 million people have crossed the border of Ukraine. They did not ask for it. They were forced to abandon their lives and their routines overnight. The quickest and the most massive displacement in Europe since World War II. And these are facts, not fiction. Such massive displacements have created an environment that exacerbates inequality and vulnerability, in particular for those first and most affected, as always in every conflict, women, girls, and children who face sexual and gender-based violence, human trafficking, and exploitation. As the devastating escalation continues in eastern Ukraine, conditions worsen for civilians who seek shelter without basics, including water, and in many cases cannot be reached with aid and cannot be evacuated safely. We have witnessed the depth of inhumanity in Mariupol. We hope not to see it elsewhere. We would like to also express our deep worries with regard to thousands of children who, according to reports, have been deported to Russia and are being held in filtration camps. International humanitarian law is clear. It classifies the forced mass deportation of people during a conflict as a war crime. We call for full clarity and independent investigation on this issue. Colleagues, various assessments from actors on the ground reveal that the top concerns for women and girls include threats to physical safety from active conflict and continued bombardment, food insecurity, lack of access to health care, including the full range of reproductive health services, care for survivors of rape, and mental health. Growing evidence of sexual violence is emerging by day from the deoccupied areas. We know now from the findings in the liberated towns in the cities in Kiev Oblast that civilians have been targeted, tortured, killed on a large scale, and that women and girls have been subject of rape as a weapon of war. There have been multiple reports and accounts of Russian soldiers breaking down the doors of cellars and basements where people were sheltering, and they have raped women. Some of such despicable actions have taken place in front of their children. Also, Ukrainian authorities have repeatedly reported cases of rape and sexual violence in non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. Human Rights Watch has documented alleged war crimes, including rape. As other towns and villages remain occupied, and actually almost 20% of the Ukraine territory, only limited evidence reaches the outside world. What was discovered in Bucha and Irpin raises concerns for the safety of women and girls in other Russian-occupied towns which are cut off from the outside world. We reiterate our call for detailed investigation on what amounts to be a systematic element in attacks on civilians committed by soldiers. Colleagues, conflict-related sexual violence is a despicable act. It is a war crime. All documented cases of sexual violence must undergo rigorous investigation. Accountability cannot and should not be an option, but a must. We strongly support the work of ICC, which has deployed teams on the ground for evidence collection on serious crimes, war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, including sexual abuse of women and children. We look also forward to the visit of the Commission of Inquiry that will start tomorrow. The documentation of sexual violence should be a standardized process. All must be done to collect credible, relevant, and reliable information on sexual violence in a manner that empowers survivors and strengthens accountability mechanisms. It is vital that all efforts are made to ensure protection and the provision of life-saving and recovery services for survivors of sexual violence in Ukraine, including access to sexual and reproduction health and rights. We need to adopt a survivor-centered approach to empower the survivors and address problems related to their stigmatization. Dear colleagues, increased risk of vulnerability goes hand in hand with human trafficking. Reports are showing that there is a high risk of trafficking for sexual exploitation at borders, especially for children and young women, often not accompanied by their family members. Taking advantage of the human drama as a result of aggression, as we heard from SRSG Patton, traffickers proliferate with false promises of all kinds in efforts to lure victims into a situation of exploitation. Therefore, greater collaboration is needed with border agencies and government partners to strengthen prevention mechanisms. Dear colleagues, Ukrainian people want the war to stop. They want to return to their homes, reunite with their loved ones, rebuild their lives safely and securely in peace. We wish for the same. Let's help Ukrainians, particularly women and girls, go from nightmares to normal life, and why not, to dreams. Only Russian tanks, missiles, and soldiers stand on their way. This war should have never started, but it must stop. But for as long as our calls go unheeded, we must prioritize and ensure the protection of civilians, women and children, gather evidence, and ensure accountability. Because, let's not forget, one day, proof will reach the court and perpetrators will be held accountable. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, let me start by expressing my gratitude to Special Representative Pamila Pratin, Natalia Karbovska of the Ukrainian Women's Fund, and Sherry Rollins-Westin of SESM Workshop for their comprehensive presentations. I would also like to thank the Albanian presidency for organizing this meeting. We appreciate the commitment to keeping the issue of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine at the top of the Security Council's agenda. Even if the Council is unable to take effective steps to respond to the most dangerous threat to international peace and security, it is still important we gathered here today. I reiterate in this regard that there is no other option but to resolve the problem of Russia's squatting in the Soviet permanent seat. The sooner the better, as the squatter, being an aggressor and violator, threatens the stability of the entire construction. We need credible counsel. We need efficient solutions. I also recognize the representatives of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. It is important that the Russian delegation continues to show up in the Security Council meetings on Ukraine. As a sort of a pre-trial meetings, they are valuable because they are on the record. Hence, everything said by the accomplices of crimes can and will be used against them in court. Of course, they have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice before they speak here for their own sake, and maybe they already do. As the entire Ukraine is bleeding now, the front line where the Russian army continues to apply the most barbaric and inhumane methods of warfare, the occupied territories where Russians consolidate the practices of terror, neocolonialism, and genocide. All and any Ukrainian cities and villages could be a target for Russian rockets, as happened with Kyiv yesterday. Distinguished colleagues, any war brings the most suffering to the most vulnerable, women and children, elderly people and persons with disabilities. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is no exception. The savage cruelty of the Russian invaders has turned the lives of millions of Ukrainians into an endless nightmare. Up to 5 million people have been recorded across Europe as individual refugees from Ukraine. Mostly women and children remain abroad. Almost 12 million people have become IDPs. We thank each and every friend who provides shelter for Ukrainians until the Russian forces are pushed out of Ukraine. And we remain extremely concerned about the destiny of those Ukrainians who have been forcefully transferred to Russia. As Russia has confessed itself, more than 1 million Ukrainian citizens have been transferred to different regions of Russia, including more than 234,000 children. Several thousand of them are orphans or deprived of parental care. We strongly condemn the decision by Russia to simplify the procedure for obtaining Russian citizenship for Ukrainian orphans or children left without parental care. This decision grossly violates the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, which obliges the occupying power not to change the civil status of children, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989. Russia refuses to provide any information on those forcibly transferred to Ukrainian authorities or international organizations. We see a real danger to those people of becoming victims of human trafficking or exploitation and abuse. We call upon the United Nations agencies to explore ways and means by which they can contribute more effectively to the protection of Ukrainian children affected by armed conflict and the facilitation of the rapid and safe return to Ukraine of those children who have been forcibly displaced or transferred to the Russian Federation. Mr. President, Ukrainian law enforcement, NGOs, and the media continue to record numerous cases of sexual violence committed by Russian troops in Ukraine. Complaints about sexual crimes committed by the invaders have been received in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kyiv, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Chernihiv regions of Ukraine. According to our Ministry of Interior, minors and elderly women were among the victims of Russian rapists. Fatalities have also been registered. The investigation of sexual crimes in the temporarily uncontrolled territories of Ukraine is currently complicated. Russian occupiers persist in removing traces by burning the bodies of tortured and raped civilians. We commend the first mission to Ukraine of the members of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which starts tomorrow. The commissioners are to visit several locations in Ukraine to get first-hand information on alleged human rights violations and abuses, and to meet with victims, witnesses, and IDPs. Ukraine remains committed to finding solutions to prevent the global food crisis, and we are ready to create the necessary conditions to resume exports from the port of Odessa. The question is how to make sure that Russia does not abuse the trade route to attack the city itself. The question that has become more relevant following Sunday's missile strike on Kyiv, when 4 rockets hit the facilities of Darnitsa car repair plant. As always, Russia claimed they had destroyed military hardware, including tanks sent by our allies. In reality, however, the plan has focused on repairing grain carrier freight cars used for railway transfers of grain to the Ukrainian seaports. It means all Putin's fairy tales about his readiness to facilitate Ukrainian wheat export that he so eloquently tells his rare interlocutors remain too far removed from reality. Listening to Putin, who says he will not use trade routes to attack Odessa, one should not forget he is the very same person who told German Chancellor Scholz and French President Macron he would not attack Ukraine days before launching a full-scale invasion. Increased pressure rather than premature and unjustified gratitude must be the common international response to Putin's empty promises. We continue our work with the UN and partners to ensure the functioning of the maritime routes for the export of Ukrainian agricultural products. As a first step, Russia must withdraw its naval forces in the maritime waters around Ukraine and provide security guarantees against attacks on ports and commercial convoys. Mr. President, Russia has never considered local residents to be trustworthy, and its attitude towards the population of the part of Donbass occupied since 2014 speaks volumes in this regard. Draft raids on the streets and apartments, forcible mobilization of all men who fail to hide. These are the sad realities of Donetsk, Luhansk, and other cities of the occupied part of Donbass. Ill-equipped, without any means of protection, they are thrown on the Ukrainian positions in the first lines, serving as a cannon fodder and a shield for Russian soldiers. There is no doubt that the same practices will be applied towards the population of the territories occupied since February. If not liberated, these territories will be turned by Russia into new strongholds for renewed attacks. We reiterate, therefore, that any concession that some well-wishers advise now will be only the way to a new war, with the same scope for violence and closer to our western borders. Ukraine as a nation, its genetic font, has been devastated multiple times in the course of at least last 100 years, beginning with the Bolsheviks' invasion and incorporation in the USSR in the first quarter of the 20th century, followed by the Stalin-ordered genocide during the artificial Great Famine of 1932-33, also widely known as Holodomor, when up to 10 million Ukrainians were starved to death by the Soviet army confiscating crops, followed by the invasion by the Soviet army of Western Ukraine in 1939, as agreed between Stalin and Hitler, when hundreds of thousands fled their homes to Europe and the Americas, and thousands were executed if they chose to stay or could not run. Continued by the annihilation when the Second World War started and the Soviets were withdrawing, setting everything on fire, everything not to let the advancing Nazi troops take advantage of it. Then by withdrawing Nazis, putting on fire and destroying everything before the Soviets regained control. Millions killed in the Second World War, both in Nazi and Soviet camps. Russification of Ukraine thereafter and until renewal of independence. The invasion of 2014, followed by the 8 long years of war and eventual full-scale invasion of 2022, when millions fled abroad and a couple of million deported or moved to Russia, where children are fostered and adopted in violation of international humanitarian right en masse. There is hardly any other European nation that has experienced such deep devastation by Bolsheviks, Stalin, Hitler, and eventually Putler, within such a short period of history. Most, if not all of it, has been man-made and executed on purpose. The lack of empathy or hypocrisy of some politicians in this context is appalling and is seen by many as the last nail in a coffin, as Ukrainians may say. 77 years ago, humankind united in its struggle to destroy evil. Dozens of millions of lives were lost in order for us to realize that appeasement and concessions to the aggressor do not work. History tends to repeat itself if its lessons are not learned. I do hope it is not about us. I do hope it is not about the United Nations. Putin's Russia must be defeated for the sake of international peace and security, for the sake of the Ukrainian people who pay the ultimate price, for the sake of people throughout the world, in particular those depending on grain supplies from our region, and for the sake of people of Russia that should return to the family of democratic nations following its deputinization. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Charles Michel, President of the European Council.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first of all, let me thank you for organizing this meeting and for giving me the occasion to take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I was born in Belgium in the 70s. At school, we studied the great European artists, names like Victor Hugo, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, Picasso, Goethe. But we also studied masterpieces by names like Dostoevsky, Kandinsky, Tchaikovsky, Tolstoy, and others. Great Russian artists from Russia's great culture, they have influenced and inspired my own education. But today, Russia's savagery stands in stark contrast to the heritage of these brilliant artists. A few months ago, I was in Borodianka, where atrocities were committed by Russian soldiers, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These crimes must be and will be punished. To hold accountable those responsible, we need evidence, and that's why we are now helping to collect the evidence of these crimes. Impunity is not an option, and we welcome the International Court of Justice provisional measures ordering Russia to suspend military operations immediately. We fully support the investigation of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the work of the Independent Commission of Inquiry. And the European Union is assisting the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and civil society to collect the evidence of war crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, women, peace, security. This is a critical and timely subject. 2 years ago, Secretary General Guterres called to end violence, both on the battlefield and in homes. Yet, as we speak, we hear reports of Russian forces wielding sexual violence as a weapon of war. Sexual violence is a war crime, a crime against humanity, a tactic of torture, terror, and repression. Shameful acts in a shameful war. And this must be exposed to the light of day and prosecuted without impunity. This war has also caused millions to flee their homes and seek refuge outside Ukraine, mostly women and children. I met many of them when I went in Ukraine, when I went in Poland, when I went in Moldova. And they are particularly vulnerable to human traffickers. We, the EU, are committed to protecting them, to keeping them safe, without any discrimination. I listened carefully to what has been said by some of you around that table. We intend to provide education, health, and access to the labor market. And we are also working to eradicate trafficking, to protect people fleeing the war. Sadly, sexual and gender-based violence is a global threat. used as a weapon of war and faced by women and girls across the world. Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, and other countries. And that's why we will host, together with UN Women, Dr. Mukwege Foundation and Nadia's Initiative, a Southern Conference on Women in Conflict in just a few days in Brussels. I sincerely hope we can build momentum and step up our collective efforts to seriously address this critical issue. Mr. Ambassador of the Russian Federation, let's be honest. The Kremlin is using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war are spilling over across the globe, and this is driving up food prices, pushing people into poverty, and destabilizing entire regions. And Russia is solely responsible for this food crisis, Russia alone, despite the Kremlin's campaign of lies and disinformation. I've seen it with my own eyes a few weeks ago in Odessa. Millions of tons of grain and wheat stuck in containers and ships because of Russian warships in the Black Sea and because of Russia's attack on transport infrastructure. And it is Russian tanks, Russian bombs and mines that are preventing Ukraine from planting and harvesting. The Kremlin is also targeting grain storages and stealing grain in Ukraine while shifting the blame on others. This is cowardly, this is propaganda, pure and simple propaganda. Let's get to the facts. The EU has no sanctions on the agricultural sector in Russia, zero. And even our sanctions on the Russian transport sector do not go beyond our EU borders. You may leave the room. Maybe it's easier not to listen to the truth, the ambassador. They do not prevent Russian flag vessels, our sanctions, from carrying grain, food, or fertilizers to developing countries. The EU, on the contrary, is doing all we can to help Ukraine's agricultural exports and to support Ukraine's agricultural sector for the coming season. Ladies and gentlemen, global food security is a top priority for the EU, and we will do everything we can to help solve this challenge and to help the developing countries. And to do this, we need to unlock the Black Sea, and we fully support Secretary General Guterres' efforts to find solutions to reopen maritime routes for Ukraine's exports. We'll actively contribute to the work of the Global Crisis Response Group and will cooperate with the G7 and with the African Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kremlin may prohibit and prosecute the use of the word war, but that does not change the heartbreaking reality. Thousands of dead Ukrainian women, children, and men, atrocities, rapes, countless Ukrainian cities bombed into rubble. This is a war, a barbaric war, waged by a permanent member of this council. Mr. Ambassador of Ukraine, we will continue to back Ukraine. We will continue to support your country and your people, and will continue to pressure Russia and to confront Russia with the truth. Russia is attacking one country, one people, Ukraine, but Russia is also attacking the values and principles of this House: human dignity, tolerance, multilateral cooperation, and international law. These are our shared values, the bedrock of this House. So this is more than a war against one nation. It is a war against all that we have built over generations since World War II. The EU's commitment to the UN Charter is unwavering. The EU is a reliable, loyal, and respectful partner, and will continue to cooperate on the global stage to build a safer, freer, and more prosperous world. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Michel for his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Albania for organizing this timely meeting and the briefers for the insightful description of the situation on the ground. Italy aligns itself with the statement just delivered by the President of the European Council and would like to add some remarks in its national capacity. During all conflicts, including in this illegal and unjustified war launched by Russia, the internally displaced and refugee women and girls are the groups at higher risk of sexual violence. As we have heard by the Special Rapporteur Patton, in addition to this already alarming situation, Ukrainian women are facing the risk of trafficking, yet another channel for sexual violence and exploitation. In fact, women continue to represent the vast majority of victims of trafficking. Such women, who are also often mothers, are attacked as symbolic representatives of their people. Rape is indeed like a military aggression on an individual scale, used also as a psychological tactic of war to humiliate, dominate, instill fear in, and then forcibly relocate the children of the victims through trafficking or forced adoptions. In this regard, it is important to strongly reiterate the extent to which minors are also the main victims of this conflict. They experience both its immediate and indirect consequences: the loss of their parents, of their country, their schools, and their homes, factors that may result in the loss of a future. Displaced and refugee children are indeed less safe and more exposed to violence and trafficking. These considerations prompted Italy to include the issue of trafficking of persons in conflict among the priorities of its last mandate at the Security Council in 2017. Our efforts resulted in an unanimous adoption by the Council of Resolution 2388 on combating trafficking of persons, which emphasizes the urgency to strengthen protection and assistance for displaced persons falling prey to trafficking, especially women and children. Italy also believes that the response to this terrible phenomenon should be based on a common understanding and a widely accepted legal framework. Therefore, we support the universal ratification and full implementation of the UN Palermo Convention and the related protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons adopted in Italy more than 20 years ago. Mr. President, the rape of women in armed conflicts cannot go unpunished. To avoid the risk of impunity, we must also increase the risk of legal consequences for all those who commit this barbaric war crime. The blatant non-compliance with the UN Security Council resolutions and international humanitarian and human rights law in this conflict shows us that much remains to be done. The work of the Security Council, if not hindered by the abuse of the veto power, can benefit from a more systematic involvement of international justice. However, when investigations and prosecutions by national or international courts are impossible or ineffective, the General Assembly should consider creating international fact-finding mechanisms in order to conduct gender-sensitive investigations and ensure the collection and preservation of evidence. At the same time, it is crucial to assist countries in situations of conflict in strengthening the rule of law and accountability mechanisms. Italy welcomes the framework of cooperation on prevention and accountability for sexual violence in conflict recently signed by the government of Ukraine and the UN Special Representative Pramila Patten. Mr. President, in addition to accountability, we have only another form of prevention of sexual violence and trafficking in this conflict, namely humanitarian assistance to protect women and children from the heinous crimes that are currently being committed in Ukraine. We must use them both. And in conclusion, Of course, the true solution to these problems, needless to say, is to stop the war. And we reiterate our call on Russian Federation to stop it. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, thank you. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. Let me start by thanking Albania for organizing this briefing and the distinguished briefers for their statements. We particularly welcome the voice of the Ukrainian civil society at the Council, and it is of utmost importance to keep our focus on the ongoing Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Mr. President, we are deeply alarmed by the shocking reports on brutal and systemic sexual violence perpetrated by Russian armed forces in Ukraine, and concerned about the increasing risk for trafficking in human beings in the region. We recall that the Council, in its Resolution 1820, demanded the immediate and complete cessation by the parties to a armed conflict of all acts of sexual violence against civilians with immediate effect. We reiterate this demand to Russian Federation. Stop immediately the sexual violence perpetrated by your armed forces in Ukraine. To ensure this, clear orders must be issued through chain of command, prohibiting sexual violence, and perpetrators must be brought to justice. Ultimately, Russia must immediately stop its military aggression, enabled by its accomplice, Belarus. Immediately and unconditionally withdraw all forces from the entire territory of Ukraine and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders, as demanded by the UNGA resolution on March 2nd. Mr. President, we welcome the recent visits by the Special Representative to the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, to Ukraine, and the framework of cooperation signed with the government of Ukraine. We look forward and encourage support to its implementation. After her visit, SRSG assessed that sexual violence committed by the Russian armed forces is raising all the red flags. We call on the relevant UN entities to continue to closely monitor the situation in Ukraine and in its borders, including regarding conflict-related sexual violence through the mechanisms created by the UN Security Council. Recording and verification of violence by the UN as well as other international actors is crucial. Current situation provides a fertile ground for human traffickers. We commend the creation of the Europol task force to protect vulnerable Ukrainian refugees from human trafficking networks. We have to carefully approach the situation to avoid instances where predators can exploit the chaos. Here, UN entities play a significant role, but so do actors from the civil society. We condemn in the strongest possible terms unlawful deportation of Ukrainian residents, in particular forced deportation of unaccompanied children to the Russian Federation by the Russian authorities and their local collaborators, as well as the illegal adoption of Ukrainian children. These actions grossly violate the international law and the UN Charter and undermine international security and stability. Mr. President, we commend Ukrainian women for their bravery and resilience in light of Russia's aggression and their role with humanitarian, political, and military response. We need decisive and vigorous action to ensure meaningful participation of women and girls, including from the most vulnerable groups, in all decision-making processes related to the crisis response and peace. Women must not be seen as victims, but as the force of change. In Resolution 2467, the Council recognized the need for a survivor-centered approach in responding to sexual violence and conflict, including access to medical and psychosocial care. It is of utmost importance that the survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine have the opportunity to report cases as soon as possible and to receive proper assistance, including access to comprehensive services, including sexual and reproductive health services. However, at the moment, reporting is possible only after survivors move to a safe area outside of territories occupied by Russian forces or where active hostilities are taking place. The Baltic states have welcomed tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. We make sure that the human rights of the survivors of sexual violence are at the heart of our response. We follow standards for the safe and effective documentation and recording of survivors' experiences, respecting their right regarding dignity, privacy, and health. Mr. President, we recall that the Council has clearly reaffirmed its intention to continue forcefully to fight impunity and uphold accountability for sexual violence. The Baltic states have taken several practical steps to call the aggressor to account for atrocities in Ukraine. We have joined the referral to the International Criminal Court of the situation in Ukraine to enable the prosecutor open investigations into allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide perpetrated in Ukraine. In order to facilitate investigations and prosecutions before the International Criminal Court, the Baltic states have nominated national experts and provided voluntary contributions. Our prosecutors, alongside those of Slovakia, Poland, Ukraine, and the International Criminal Court, have formed the joint investigation team. In conclusion, we commend the efforts of the UN bodies, non-governmental organizations, and members of civil society working on the ground in Ukraine, providing services to survivors of sexual violence and trafficking. Security and access of those workers is crucial to alleviate the immeasurable human suffering that Russia's unprovoked war is causing. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Albania for organizing this important Security Council meeting. I also thank the briefers for their very important contributions, and Germany aligns itself with the statement made by the President of the European Council. Mr. President, we have learned from the history of war and conflicts around the world that conflict-related sexual violence has been used as a tactical or strategic means of weakening, if not destroying, the adversary by targeting the civilian population. A multitude of reports indicate that the ongoing, unjustified, unprovoked war of aggression of the Russian Federation against its neighboring state, Ukraine, is unfortunately no exception. And Germany calls on the Russian Federation to stop this illegal war, withdraw their troops from their sovereign neighboring states, Ukraine, and stop also these aggressions that we are hearing of. Mr. President, we have heard with shock and horror many accounts about brutal cases of conflict-related sexual violence in the war on Ukraine, predominantly against women and girls, but also against men and boys. And we know that amidst the chaos of war, declenched by the Russian Federation, with limited support on the ground and almost no access to services, and while millions are fleeing, as the SRSG reported it today, the risks of sexual and gender-based violence being largely unaccounted for are high. In this context, I would like to address 5 points, and the first one is reporting and monitoring are key to hold the perpetrators accountable. We therefore support SRSG's patent demands to reinforce the staff of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission and the Prosecutor General in Ukraine with CRSV specialized personnel. With the escalation of Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine is already reaching its limits. Second, we also commend the framework of cooperation that SRSG Patton and the Ukrainian government signed on her recent visit to Ukraine. It is a vital condition for the SRSG's office and her team of experts to commence their work on site. We see this as a matter of urgency since the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating in the course of Russia's ongoing war. Healthcare, especially sexual and reproductive health, mental health services and psychological counseling are insufficient considering the scale of the crisis with numerous internally displaced people. Rapid and effective action is necessary. This is why we will continue our funding for the Office of the SRSG in 2022. My third point, a survivor-centered approach is essential to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. 3 years after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2467 put forward by Germany, we are concerned about its slow implementation. The international community must strengthen the survivors' rights and improve their access to justice, sexual and reproductive health and rights, rehabilitation, reparations, and reintegration. Fourth, women often suffer most from the consequences of war. Mostly women are the ones fleeing the country with children and elderly. They are the ones who are the main targets of conflict-related sexual violence, but also of trafficking in persons when trying to escape from the violence. Germany will continue its engagement to fight trafficking in persons, including by promoting the resolution on this topic in the Human Rights Council. And to protect the Ukrainian women coming to Germany, we have installed several protection mechanisms like websites that inform in Ukrainian, active information in the trains that the refugees use, and police presence at the train stations. And fifth, Germany reiterates its pledge to fight conflict-related sexual violence in all contexts. In the case of Ukraine, that means that while we continue our efforts to stop this illegal and unjustified war, we will work equally hard to mitigate the immediate effects of the war on the Ukrainian people. Human security, responding to the humanitarian crisis, addressing the profoundly gendered implications of wars and conflict, they are not secondary considerations. They are central to our foreign policy decisions. Our feminist foreign policy implies, inter alia, to take into account the repercussions of war and conflict on all segments of the population, especially on those individuals who are particularly vulnerable or marginalized. Finally, let me stress that our concerns are not limited to the tragic situation in Ukraine. Germany will keep the efforts and the support in a global context combating sexual and gender-based violence at the top of our priorities. In 2021 alone, German humanitarian assistance funded projects with vital components addressing sexual and gender-based violence, totaling to an amount of more than $80 million. This made Germany the largest donor of the Oslo Pledging Conference. Germany also continues to be the largest donor for ICRC's Special Appeal on Sexual Violence. And earlier this year, German humanitarian assistance launched a new and innovative project with UN Women to strengthen measures against sexual and gender-based violence in humanitarian response plans. We will continue to remain focused to this highly important issue. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. Chair, I wish to thank you for this briefing, allowing us to discuss yet another troubling aspect of the war in Ukraine, which needs to be brought to the attention of the international community. And I thank briefers for their valuable words, but even more for their very valuable deeds on the ground. Every conflict brings a terrible suffering to the civilians. The Russian aggression against Ukraine is no exception. Civilians, in particular women and children, became targets of not only the Russian rockets and bombs, but also cruel, cynical, and merciless perpetrators of trafficking in human beings and gender-based violence. Poland, as a neighbor country and primary destination of the refugees coming from Ukraine, is especially aware of those harsh realities. And along humanitarian aid related to the hosting on the Polish soil the largest number of refugees in history, we are also undertaking considerable efforts to address the effects of the conflict-related human trafficking and sexual abuse. All our efforts are conducted according to the Polish, EU, and international regulations in non-discriminatory manner. Mr. Chair, Polish Border Guard and police have implemented numerous measures aimed at preventing and mitigating these effects, including specialized and awareness-raising training for the officers, as well as information campaigns for existing and potential victims. 24/7, any accident of possible human trafficking and sexual crimes can be reported to police officers speaking Ukrainian and Russian. All reported incidents are subject to the prompt verification. Relevant information leaflets in Polish, English, and Ukrainian are widely distributed among the refugees, local governments, NGOs, media, and through the internet. In addition, to prevent human trafficking, police is deploying officers and anti-crime section to the border regions, border crossings, train and bus stations, as well as reception centers in order to help potential victims and identify individuals or groups trying to exploit them. In the case an alleged crime is reported, police is assisting the potential victim that does not speak Polish with an interpreter and other specialized assistance that may be needed. State structures are joined in these efforts by numerous NGOs active on the ground from day one. Moreover, the Polish government has urgently implemented new immigration measures for Ukrainians fleeing the war by adopting a special law in March and effective from the 24th February. It stipulates that Ukrainian refugees can obtain a Polish ID number which entitles them to work legally in Poland, get free access to the public healthcare system, schooling and social benefits and support. Ukrainian citizens have access to Polish healthcare system on the same footing and are subject to the same entitlements as insured Polish citizens, including when it comes to the psychological and sexual healthcare. What is more, all reception centers in the region neighboring Ukraine have first aid medical points are assigned to specific hospitals' emergency services in the region. Mr. Chair, we commend the work of the UN system preventing and responding to the conflict-related sexual violence and support the member states in its support to the member states, aimed at strengthening national responsibilities in this respect. In this context, I would like to mention the important actions by the UNHCR and UNICEF that offer valuable expertise and support in emergency situations. Mr. Chair, aside from the immediate action, we must ensure accountability for these crimes at both national and international levels. It constitutes a key element of prevention and justice for victims on which we must deliver. It is a matter of urgency, not only for the victims, but also for the credibility of the whole international system established by us, the United Nations. Let me finish by referring to the ranking of the states helping Ukraine the most, in these terms of political, military, financial and other support, just published by the Forbes Ukraine, where Poland has ranked first, with the US and Estonia following. We are thankful for this kind of appreciation, but would prefer to trade it for the end of this war of aggression waged by Russia, and instead entering the ranking of the states helping Ukraine to rebuild stronger, even more resilient. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, allow me to thank the special representatives, Ms. Pramila Patten, and the representatives of the civil society for their comprehensive, insightful briefing. For more than 100 days, we have been witnessing the Russian unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of international law. For more than 100 days, Ukrainian citizens have been bravely defending their own motherland, lives, and their basic right to decide freely about their future. Over more than 100 days, they have been defending rules which have guaranteed the stability and peace for the European continent. The very rules that the Russian Federation decided to flagrantly breach. The international community already made a commitment to help Ukraine in its reconstruction and recovery as soon as this nightmare is over. Yes, Ukraine will undoubtedly flourish once again, but the blood of victims of this senseless war will be forever dried on the palms of the hands of the Russian Federation. As of 3rd of June, more than 9,000 civilian casualties have been recorded by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Needless to say, this number is much bigger in reality. The situation of vulnerable groups, including women, is particularly disturbing. While fully recognizing the impact this shameless war has on them, we must unfortunately expect worse until the President Putin decided to stop this heinous war. Since 24th of February, women specifically have been disproportionately affected by the war. The Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, other agencies and world media have recorded the rise of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, sexual abuse and human trafficking. We seize this opportunity to condemn once again acts of sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian forces, which belong to the most hideous violations of the laws of armed conflict. Slovakia does and will continue to work with our partners to ensure that those perpetrators will be held accountable for crimes committed in Ukraine. Another deplorable issue is the detrimental effect that rape, human trafficking, and other forms of sexual abuse and exploitation have on the physical and mental health of victims. For traffickers, the crisis is not a tragedy, but an opportunity to exploit people in need. In this regard, women and other vulnerable groups who experienced trauma and sexual violence must have access to adequate medical care, including to the access to psychological support and elementary sexual and reproductive health services and rights. Since the beginning of the aggression of the Russian Federation, about 490,000 refugees have entered Slovakia so far, mostly women and children. Slovakia adopted numerous legislative and administrative measures to help women in need, and we will continue to do so. In this vein, I would also like to praise civil society and people of Slovakia who have expressed a big solidarity and provided those fleeing Ukraine with necessary assistance. Mr. President, last but not least, allow me to reiterate that the aggressor accountable for this situation is evident. Slovakia calls for an immediate cessation of Russian military activities in Ukraine and unconditional withdrawal of all Russian troops from the whole territory of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. This meeting is adjourned.